Hi, I'm Tessa with Brainrot News. Welcome to your weekly recap from March 30th through April 5th. The world is still somehow turning, though it's making some suspicious noises. Another 7 days of bad decisions, climate grief, and billionaires doing performance art with your future. If you're listening while cleaning, studying, or drifting off to sleep, bold move, but I'm not one to judge. I'm not sure self-care is listening to stories about war crimes and collapsing infrastructure, but whatever gets you off, let's get into it.
Brainrot the news.
Russia continued its grand tradition of war crimes this week, launching drone strikes on Kharkiv. They hit a military hospital, a shopping center, and residential buildings, because apparently the concept of military targets is just a suggestion now. 2 people were killed and dozens were injured, including wounded Ukrainian soldiers who had already done their time on the battlefield but still weren't safe from Russian missiles. President Zelensky condemned the attacks, once again stating the painfully obvious. Russia has no interest in ending this war, only in stretching it out like a cat batting around a half-dead mouse. Meanwhile, over in the US, President Trump, the ever hard-nosed statesman, took a break from his usual schedule of rage posting and courtroom visits to scold Putin, not for the attacks, but because he wasn't being nice to Zelensky, saying that he was angry that Putin attacked Zelensky's credibility. In what can only be described as a masterclass in meaningless threats, Trump hinted at possible sanctions if Putin doesn't agree to peace. Because nothing intimidates a dictator like the hypothetical inconvenience of a slightly higher export tax. It's like watching a mall security guard wag his finger at a shoplifter while holding the door open for them. And of course, Trump made sure to emphasize that despite all this, his very special relationship with Putin remains intact. Because when the world is on fire, Trump is less concerned with grabbing the extinguisher and more worried about making sure the arsonist still saves him a seat at dinner. Iran has officially responded to Trump's diplomatic heartfelt outreach by slamming the door and bolting it shut. President Masoud Pezeshkian rejected Trump's request for direct nuclear negotiations, instead offering maybe, but only if you ask through a responsible adult. Given the US's track record of signing deals and then setting them on fire, Iran's skepticism makes perfect sense. After all, the last time Iran sat down with America in good faith, it got the 2015 nuclear deal, only to have Trump rip it up and toss it into the geopolitical garbage disposal. Since then, his administration has done everything short of mailing Iran a breakup mixtape titled Sanctions and Sabotage. So when Iran says the US needs to prove it can actually keep its word, it's not exactly asking something unreasonable. Meanwhile, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei reaffirmed his stance that direct talks with the US are about as wise as sticking a fork in an electrical socket. And with Trump steering America's foreign policy like a drunk teenager playing chicken in his dad's car, he's got a point. So how did Trump handle this rejection? Did he attempt a more measured approach, offer a compromise? Of course not. Instead, what he did was what he does best: threaten unprecedented military action. Because in his mind, diplomacy isn't about finding solutions, it's about forcing submission. If negotiations fail, just raise the stakes and see who blinks first. The problem is when you treat diplomacy like a game of chicken. It works great right up until someone doesn't swerve. And considering Trump is just the kind of guy who'd rather drive full speed off of a cliff than admit he was wrong, the rest of the world just gets to watch and hope he doesn't take everyone else down with him. Donald Trump is once again floating the idea of liberating Greenland, whether it wants to be or not. After failing to buy the island back in 2019, Trump now suggests that military force is a perfectly reasonable backup plan. Because why engage in diplomacy when you can just point a gun at someone and call it a real estate deal? Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen was, to put it mildly, not amused, calling Trump's rhetoric inappropriate between close allies, which is diplomatic speak for what the actual hell is wrong with you. But the Trump administration is doubling down, with Vice President J.D. Vance accusing Denmark of neglecting Greenland's security and suggesting that the US needs to stop it, purely for Greenland's safety, of course. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, who already had to humor Trump's first attempt to buy Greenland like it was a Manhattan timeshare, has reiterated that Greenland is not for sale, not up for grabs, and definitely not in need of unsolicited American protection. Meanwhile, Greenlandic leaders have formed a coalition explicitly rejecting US intervention, as they'd like to remain an autonomous territory rather than become the world's coldest military base. Copenhagen has now seen protests against Trump's absurd land grab, with Danes waving signs telling the US to back off. But in classic Trump fashion, rather than acknowledging that Greenland isn't a prize up for auction, his administration is rattling its saber and pretending that Denmark is the unreasonable one. Meanwhile, Denmark is still trying to be the adult in the room, offering enhanced security cooperation under the 1951 Defense Agreement, a reasonable attempt at addressing Arctic tensions without forced annexation. But Trump doesn't seem interested in collaboration when conquest is still on the menu, because apparently the lessons of colonialism weren't humiliating enough the first time. Nothing quite says freedom like the United States demanding foreign companies fall in line with its latest right-wing crackdown on diversity, and a move that perfectly captures the spirit of imperial micromanagement. The US Embassy in Paris allegedly sent letters to major French companies warning them that Trump's executive order dismantling diversity, equity, and inclusion policies wasn't just an American nightmare, it was their problem now too. France, being France, was not amused. Minister of Equality Aurore Berge accused U.S. diplomats of playing colonial overlord, calling the letter a diktat, which is a fancy European way of saying, "Who the hell do you think you are?" The letter, supposedly signed by a State Department official, instructed companies to certify their compliance with the new anti-DEI measures within 5 days, because diplomacy is a corporate loyalty test delivered by international mail. Predictably, the French government isn't having it. Many businesses are flat out ignoring the order because, unlike their American counterparts, they don't live in constant fear of Trump's next tantrum. Meanwhile, the US Embassy has gone radio silent on the matter, probably hoping the world forgets about it before anyone has to admit that strong-arming foreign companies into discrimination is a weird diplomatic strategy. So here we are, the country that never stops preaching about free markets is now telling foreign companies how to run their hiring policies, because nothing terrifies the modern American right like the idea of someone, somewhere, promoting diversity. If the Trump administration thought the French would simply roll over, they clearly forgot who invented the guillotine. Hamas has agreed to a ceasefire proposal brokered by Egypt and Qatar. The deal? Release 5 hostages, including an American-Israeli citizen, in exchange for Israel allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza, temporarily stopping the bombardment and releasing hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. Seems like a pretty basic trade-off. Stop massacring civilians, let food and medicine in, and in return, hostages get released. But because Israel's leadership thrives on never-ending conflict, Bibi Netanyahu responded with a counter-offer. Netanyahu, ever the peacemaker, and by peacemaker I mean warmonger who dreams of an eternal state of war, insists that Hamas must disarm and that its leaders must leave Gaza before Israel even considers ending the relentless airstrikes. This of course translates to, we'll keep bombing until Hamas agrees to vanish into thin air and hand Gaza over on a silver platter. Hamas official Sami Abu Zuri called Netanyahu's stance a surefire way to guarantee the bloodshed never ends. Which, let's be real, is exactly the point. The ceasefire phase, which began on January 19th, involved a hostage exchange and a temporary halt to the fighting. But surprise, Israel didn't actually stop its military operations, and as a result, the death toll in Gaza has soared past 50,000 according to the Gaza Health Ministry. So while negotiations drag on, Israel's been busy turning Gaza into rubble, killing civilians en masse, and making sure humanitarian aid remains a logistical nightmare. Meanwhile, families of hostages in Israel continue to rally, begging for a deal that actually brings their loved ones home. But Netanyahu, with his career dependent on maintaining a state of war, has bigger priorities, like keeping the military-industrial complex happy and ensuring his far-right coalition doesn't implode. Because strong leadership is when you reject peace deals so you can keep bombing a starving population while pretending it's all for security. Well, everyone, it finally happened. Dr. Peter Marks, the FDA's top vaccine expert and one of the last people in government who actually understands science, has officially resigned. Why? Probably because he's stuck in a never-ending nightmare where he has to fight against a man who thinks Wi-Fi makes you sick and vaccines are a deep state mind control plot. That man, of course, is Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who unfortunately worked his way into a government position despite being best known for tanking his own family's legacy by becoming a professional science denier. Marks, who was critical in the rapid authorization of COVID-19 vaccines, basically said, "I'm done arguing with a guy who doesn't even believe in reality." And honestly, good for him. There's only so many times you can hear, "What about autism?" from a guy who has absolutely no idea how vaccines work before your soul starts to wither. Though, unfortunately, this of course is a massive disaster for public health. The Biotechnology Innovation Organization is already panicking, warning that Mark's departure will kneecap scientific standards and slow down the development of life-saving treatments. Because it turns out when you let an anti-vax lunatic run the Department of Health and Human Services, actual experts don't really want to stick around for the circus. And it is a circus. Just look at what's happening already. Mass layoffs in the department, vaccines programs getting gutted, and oh yeah, a brand new measles outbreak in the United States, and it's spreading across the country. That's right, measles. The disease we basically eradicated is now coming back because RFK Jr. has spent a great deal of his life convincing people that vaccines are more dangerous than actual deadly viruses. Let's not forget, this is the same guy who swore up and down during his Senate confirmation hearings that he wouldn't undermine vaccines. And that lasted about 5 minutes, because of course it did. His entire brand is selling conspiracy theories to the kind of people who think drinking bleach is an immune booster. Now he has real power, and instead of, say, using it to improve healthcare, he's busy undoing decades of medical progress so he can appease a bunch of Facebook moms and Joe Rogan listeners. At this rate, the FDA is going to be replaced by a wellness blog, vaccine mandates will be swapped out for essential oil recommendations, and we'll all be asked to fight the next pandemic with positive vibes and prayer. But hey, on the bright side, RFK Jr. and his followers will finally get to experience a world without modern medicine. Too bad the rest of us are stuck in it with them. Donald Trump is throwing yet another tantrum, this time at the Supreme Court, because the lower courts kept getting in the way of his dream of turning America into a dystopian hellscape. In just the past week, the Justice Department has filed 3 emergency appeals, bringing the total to 6 since the beginning of his second term. And what's got him so worked up? Well, the usual mix of xenophobia, authoritarian overreach, and good old-fashioned bigotry, of course. These emergency appeals cover a greatest hits list of right-wing fever dreams: stripping birthright citizenship, mass deportations, cutting federal funds for teachers, because why educate people when you can just feed them propaganda, and attacking transgender rights. Oh, and let's not forget trying to overturn rulings that have already smacked down his attempts to rewrite federal spending laws. You know, because the guy who built his entire empire on fraud and unpaid contractors definitely knows how to handle a budget better than the entire judicial system. Trump's legal strategy is simple. If a lower court tells him he can't do something wildly unconstitutional, he just runs to the Supreme Court like a spoiled kid demanding daddy fix it. And unfortunately, Daddy, also known as the ultra-conservative Supreme Court, has a history of indulging him. Back in his first term, the court granted Trump favorable decisions in 28 out of 41 emergencies. Compare that to Obama and Bush, who only bothered the Supreme Court for emergency relief 8 times in 16 years. Trump is on pace to shatter records, not for governing well, but for throwing the most legal temper tantrums per term. The latest cases include efforts to ramp up mass deportations of Venezuelan migrants. Because if there's one thing Republicans hate more than immigrants, it's immigrants fleeing socialism. They want to stop the reinstatement of fired federal workers, probably the ones purged for not swearing loyalty to the dear leader, and bring back his attack on birthright citizenship, because being pro-constitution is when you try to rewrite the 14th Amendment with an executive order. This isn't just about winning cases, this is about sending a message to the lower courts. Defy me, and I'll run to the highest court in the land until they fix it for me. It's a full-blown assault on judicial independence designed to intimidate judges into rubber stamping whatever authoritarian garbage he dreams up next. Donald Trump is back again, proving that his administration runs with the discipline and security of a group of teenagers making sure they don't lose their snap streak. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz accidentally added journalist Jeffrey Goldberg to a Signal group chat where they were discussing sensitive U.S. military operations against Yemen's Houthi rebels. That's right, the people responsible for national security are handling classified discussions with the same care as your uncle forwarding chain emails about chemtrails. But don't worry, Trump says it's fine. Waltz is fine, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is fine, nobody's getting fired, because nothing is actually ever a problem in Trump world unless it involves someone daring to hold him accountable. Trump brushed the incident off as a mere glitch, because accidentally revealing military strategy to a journalist is apparently on the same level as forgetting to update your iPhone. Democrats, and probably anyone who still believes in basic national security protocols, are pointing out that discussing classified information on an encrypted messaging app is the kind of amateur hour blunder that would have had Republicans foaming at the mouth if it had happened under a Democratic administration. But instead of acknowledging the recklessness, Trump assured everyone that his administration won't be using it very much anymore. Because that's how national security works, right? Just kinda not doing the thing that got you in trouble for a little while. And in a twist that surprised absolutely no one, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard refused to confirm whether she was using a government-issued or personal phone during these discussions. Because why follow security protocols when you can just shrug your way through a Senate hearing and hope people stop asking questions? Meanwhile, intelligence officials are scrambling to figure out whether any of the information in the chat is now considered classified, with CIA Director John Ratcliffe apparently deciding Pete Hegseth will be the one to make that call. In any functioning democracy, this would have been a massive scandal, with an administration so reckless with sensitive military strategy that they're accidentally inviting journalists into the chat. But in Trump's America, just another day in a government that's being run like a tech startup that's 3 weeks away from collapsing. Well, we're officially bringing back diseases from the 19th century because a certain demographic decided that science is just a suggestion. Texas, the land of freedom from common sense, has now hit 400 confirmed measles cases since January, leading the country in what can only be described as a preventable catastrophe. Gaines County alone is shouldering 270 of these cases, meaning it's basically become the Disneyland of measles, except instead of Mickey Mouse, it's just a highly contagious virus hanging around in the air waiting to ruin your life. And it's not just Texas. The five-alarm stupidity has spread across 5 states, with New Mexico reporting 44 cases and its first adult measles-related death. Kansas has 23 cases, mostly among, you probably guessed it, unvaccinated children. Oklahoma, never one to be left out of a public health disaster, has 9 cases directly linked to Texas. And Ohio, always a sleeper pick for where bad things happen, has 10 new cases in Ashtabula County. Health officials, who must be exhausted from explaining the basics of germ theory to a country that has Google but refuses to use it correctly, are begging people to get the MMR vaccine. But of course, thanks to the efforts of anti-vaccine conspiracy theorists, led by none other than Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., we now have a growing population of people who think overdosing on vitamin A is a reasonable treatment, but vaccines are a mind-control government plot. Meanwhile, the CDC has confirmed that 2025 has already surpassed last year's total measles cases, proving that when it comes to making things worse, America never fails to deliver. The thing about measles, besides the fact that it can kill people, is that it lingers in the air and clings to surfaces like a Republican clings to voter suppression laws. The only way to stop it is through herd immunity, which shockingly requires people to actually get vaccinated. Instead, we're dealing with a health crisis brought to you by the same crowd that thinks vaccines cause autism, but is totally fine with pumping their bodies full of horse dewormer and essential oils. So as Texas continues its proud tradition of leading the nation in things that shouldn't be happening, the rest of us are left watching in horror as a disease we solved decades ago makes a comeback because in America, learning from history is just another thing that died of preventable causes. The World Health Organization, the global body responsible for keeping plagues in check, is now facing a financial crisis so severe that it might even need a wellness check. Thanks to Donald Trump's masterclass in international sabotage, the US has yanked its funding because apparently punishing the world for surviving a pandemic is a top Republican priority. The result? The WHO is slashing 21% of its budget, because what better time to defund global health than when antibiotic-resistant superbugs and re-emerging diseases are making a comeback like a horror movie villain that just won't die. The new, leaner, significantly less effective WHO will be operating on $4.2 billion instead of $5.3 billion for the 2026-2027 period. And with budget cuts come job cuts, meaning the organization tasked with preventing the next global catastrophe is now offering voluntary early retirements to the people who actually know what they're doing. The WHO headquarters in Geneva is taking a big hit, as are programs around the world, because apparently healthcare is just another thing that needs subjected to the free market's benevolent wisdom. The WHO is now begging other countries and private donors to fill the financial hole left by the US, a hole that previously covered 18% of the WHO's entire budget. This is like setting someone's house on fire, then yelling at them for not having homeowners insurance. But of course, Trump's America doesn't do international responsibility. It's too busy banning DEI programs and trying to deport everyone who isn't white enough to pass the paper bag test. The consequences of these cuts will be absolutely devastating. We're talking about potential HIV treatment shortages in 8 countries, because apparently access to life-saving medication is just another thing that depends on the whims of American right-wing temper tantrums. health services in Afghanistan, which were already hanging by a thread, are now at even greater risk. Let's not forget the dozens of other health initiatives that will quietly crumble because of this crazy decision. Final decisions on which life-saving programs will be sacrificed to budgetary doom are expected by the end of April. So if you were hoping for the WHO to lead the charge against the next pandemic, or address the rise of antibiotic-resistant infections, or just do its job, well, better hope some billionaire has a guilty conscience and feels generous. Otherwise, buckle up, because this is how you get a world where measles, polio, and new mystery viruses run wild, while the US pats itself on the back for owning the libs by making sure even fewer people survive the next pandemic. Donald Trump, the man who still can't spell hamburger, has once again decided that America's whole democracy thing is just a little too restrictive for his liking. Trump has openly suggested that despite the Constitution forbidding it, he's very interested in serving a third term, because let's be honest, once you've tasted authoritarianism, 2 terms just isn't enough. In a recent review, Trump claimed it was too early to seriously consider it, but definitely not too early to start scheming. One of his brilliant ideas, a constitutional convention which would require 2/3 of the US states to agree to rewrite the nation's founding document. That's right, Trump wants to rewrite the Constitution because if there's anyone who understands law and governance, it's a man who thinks the nuclear triad is a breakfast combo meal. This plan has a few minor obstacles, like the fact that 38 states would have to ratify the change, but that hasn't stopped his allies, like America's favorite fraudster Steve Bannon, from floating alternative routes. Bannon's genius idea? Having Vice President J.D. Vance win in 2028 and then just give the presidency back to Trump, because apparently laws don't matter if you just make them up as you go. Naturally, this casual discussion of dismantling democracy in real time has set off alarm bells for anyone who has read a history book not printed in Florida. Political analysts, legal scholars, and people who are still tethered to reality have pointed out that this kind of rhetoric is how you get a dictatorship, but Trump's base? Oh no, they love it. Nothing says owning the libs quite like openly advocating for the Putinization of America. Now you might be asking, what about Congress, the courts, the Constitution itself? Cute. This is a man who attempted a coup on live television and faced 0 consequences. He got a second term and he doesn't seem to be keen on ending it there. So here we are, Trump openly floating the idea of a permanent Trump regime and his allies brainstorming ways to make it happen. America's democracy has been walking on thin ice since 2016. The real question now isn't will Trump try to stay in power indefinitely, it's what and who is going to stop him. Global stock markets are currently in freefall, all bracing for the economic doomsday now marketed as Liberation Day. Yes, President Donald Trump is set to announce his latest round of tariffs on April 2nd, a day that will be remembered either as a great leap for economic nationalism or the moment the global economy collectively curled up and died. In the US, the S&P 500 is down 0.6%, the Nasdaq is tanking by 1.6%, and the Dow Jones is hanging on for dear life, just barely managing some gains like a drunk gambler convinced the next hand will save him. Meanwhile, Tesla and Nvidia are leading the corporate bloodbath, which is bad news for anyone who still believes in the tech bubble. Abroad, Japan's Nikkei index has collapsed by 4%, South Korea's Kospi has dropped 3%, and France's CAC 40 is down 1.6%, because apparently the entire planet just realized tariffs aren't some magical fix, but rather the economic equivalent of setting your house on fire to protest high rent. Investors, recognizing that we're all careening toward a recession cliff, are panic buying gold and hoarding treasury bonds like it's the financial apocalypse, which I guess to be fair it might be. The Trump administration insists these tariffs will liberate the US economy, which by that they probably mean jack up consumer prices, obliterate corporate profits, and stall growth. Goldman Sachs has even bumped up the chances of a recession to 35%, though let's be honest, that number is about as comforting as being told there's only a 35% chance your parachute won't open. But don't worry, Trump and his economic team, the same masterminds who thought a trade war with China was a fun idea, swear that tariffs will supercharge domestic manufacturing and shrink the deficit, because clearly the best way to reduce government debt is to tank the stock market and make everything more expensive. So buckle up, because if history has taught us anything, it's that Trump's grand economic plans tend to go about as well as his bankrupt casinos. The Democratic Party is spiraling into full-scale self-destruction as the base has realized that their own leadership is just as complicit in the slow-motion train wreck of American democracy as Trump and his merry band of fascist fanboys. The rage that was once reserved only for the right is now turning inward, and the party's old guard establishment is learning the hard way that you can't just coast on not being a Republican forever. Take Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. He's facing so much backlash that his book tour has been postponed indefinitely, which is a real shame because we would all love reading another middle-aged politician's memoir about how hard it is to do the bare minimum. He's been dodging protests and calls for a primary challenge, but there's only so long you can run from the consequences of your own performative resistance. For years, Democratic leadership has played the role of the sensible adults in the room, but now that room is on fire, and they're still trying to negotiate with the arsonists. This internal revolt is shaping up to be the Democrats' version of the Tea Party insurgency, except instead of a bunch of rage-fueled geriatrics screaming about hating Obamacare, this movement is full of people who actually want to fix things. But don't expect the party elders to go quietly. They're already doing their best to suppress the grassroots uprising, clinging to power like a drunk hanging on to the last bar stool of the night. Meanwhile, the party is using upcoming elections like the Wisconsin Supreme Court race and Florida's special House election as a makeshift stress test to see just how much of a beating they can take before they have to pretend to listen to voters. Polling doesn't look great, with Democratic voters making it crystal clear that they're sick of watching their leaders play footsie with Republicans while the country lurches forward into full-blown authoritarianism. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders are still pulling crowds that could fill stadiums, proving that hunger for actual leftist policies isn't going anywhere. And in Arizona, party bosses are getting the boot in favor of challengers like Kat Abu Ghazali, who's calling out the Democratic establishment for what it is, a collection of overpaid losers who specialize in losing gracefully. At this rate, if Democratic leadership doesn't wake up and realize that their base actually expects them to fight, they're going to find themselves out of a job, because the people they're failing to stand up to, they aren't just trying to win elections, they're trying to dismantle democracy brick by brick. And if the Democrats' response to that is another press release expressing deep concern, they deserve every ounce of rage coming their way. Once again, Israel is doing what it does best, forcing Palestinians from their homes at gunpoint while pretending it's all in the name of security. This time, the Israeli military has ordered the evacuation of Rafah, Gaza's last so-called safe zone, because when your entire strategy revolves around ethnic cleansing, the only logical next step is to finish the job. This comes after Israel spent a great deal of time doing everything in its power to harm Palestinians by blocking food, fuel, and medicine for 2 million people to pressure Hamas into rewriting the truce agreement. Because being the good guy is when you starve an entire population into submission. And let's be honest, Israel never wanted a ceasefire to begin with. They just needed a break to reload and hope the Palestinians let their guard down. If that wasn't enough, Israel also managed to outdo itself in sheer brutality by murdering 15 medics in Rafah. These weren't people caught in some crossfire, they were wearing uniforms, riding in marked ambulances, and trying to save lives. But to Israel, a Palestinian in a uniform is just another target. The United Nations condemned it, aid organizations condemned it, but Netanyahu, he's too busy doubling down on plans to take over Gaza and push Trump's disgusting resettlement scheme, which Palestinians have rejected, and human rights experts are calling illegal. Of course, Netanyahu doesn't care. Why would he? Israel has spent decades bulldozing homes, stealing land, and committing war crimes with zero consequences. And thanks to the US government and its blank check of military aid, they don't even have to pretend to care, because when you have American politicians in your pocket and the world's most powerful propaganda machine on your side, genocide is just another policy decision. But here's the thing, history doesn't forget. The world is waking up, and no amount of PR spin or Hasbara-funded nonsense can hide the fact that Israel's actions in Gaza are a crime against humanity. The question is, how much longer will the world watch this horror show unfold before finally saying enough? How long can you keep pretending this isn't wrong? Donald Trump, lifelong champion of the working man, if the working man is a billionaire tax cheat, has signed an executive order officially kneecapping federal labor unions and agencies that deal with national security. Because when your entire governing philosophy revolves around punishing people for existing, gutting workers' rights is just another Tuesday. The order effectively bans collective bargaining for workers in departments like State, Defense, Homeland Security, specifically the border security folks, because of course, and even the VA, because we love our veterans means stripping them them of their rights in the workplace. Yep, the justification? The administration dug up an old provision in the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, claiming that labor unions could impede vital operations, because obviously it's unionized janitors and HR reps who are the real threat to national security, not the guys leaking military plans in a signal chat. Naturally, unions are pissed. The American Federation of Government Employees is taking this to court because, shocker, many of the workers affected are veterans, the very people the administration claims to worship. Meanwhile, the Justice Department is already filing lawsuits in Texas, because that's where all bad ideas go to thrive, to help grease the wheels for eliminating collective bargaining agreements. AFL-CIO President Liz Schuler called it what it is, pure political revenge. Trump has always hated unions, mostly because he's never had to work a day in his life and thinks solidarity is a word you only use when defending your favorite dictator. The White House is sticking to its talking points, insisting that this is all about protecting national security from the terrifying threat of workers negotiating for fair wages and job protections. At the end of the day, this is just another chapter in the long-running GOP playbook. Strip workers of their rights, claim it's for their own good, and then act surprised when the economy crashes. America first is when you make sure the people keeping the country running have absolutely no say in how they're treated. Nothing brings people together quite like unhinged billionaire tyranny. Protests have erupted across the United States and Europe as people rally against Elon Musk's reign of terror at the so-called Department of Government Efficiency. Under Trump's watch, Musk has been handed the keys to a government purge operation so extreme that it makes Reaganomics look like a universal basic income plan. Entire agencies are being deleted, sensitive government data is now just a fun little side project for his child tech bros, and social safety nets are being trimmed with the efficiency of a Tesla self-driving car veering into oncoming traffic. The nationwide demonstrations have hit Tesla where it hurts, right in the showroom. Protesters stormed all 277 Tesla locations in the US chanting "Honk if you hate Elon" and "Fight the billionaire oligarchy," proving once again that people are really over this guy's nonsense. Meanwhile, in London, protesters compared Musk's government overhaul to, you guessed it, authoritarian regimes, because when you start firing civil servants en masse and handing classified documents to meme stock traders, that's generally not great for democracy. The movement, Tesla Takedown, has some notable backers. Disillusioned Tesla owners, because even the fanboys are tired of Musk. Celebrities like John Cusack and Democratic lawmakers like Representative Jamie Crockett and Representative Jayapal have all thrown their weight behind the resistance. While most protests have been peaceful, some have taken a turn for the extreme, such as Tesla vehicles torched in Rome and incendiary devices found at a dealership in Austin, Texas. U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi was quick to label these acts domestic terrorism, proving once again that property damage to the rich is the only crime that ever gets taken seriously in America. The great news? Tesla's European sales have plummeted by 49% in just 2 months. Turns out people don't love the idea of their car payments funding Musk's tech road dictatorship, and with public sentiment now at an all-time low, Musk might soon find himself in a rare and unfamiliar position, actually facing consequences for his actions. In yet another episode of the Elon Musk and systematic dismantling of reality, a federal court filing alleges that an employee from the Department of Government Efficiency, the same agency currently treating the federal government like an overstaffed Subway franchise, has been put in charge of the U.S. Institute of Peace. That's right, Peace, the think tank funded by Congress once dedicated to preventing wars and stabilizing global conflicts, is now apparently just another casualty of Musk's hostile takeover of American governance. This appointment comes hot on the heels of a late-night mass firing of nearly all 300 USIP employees, because nothing screams commitment to peace like a bloodless bureaucratic purge. Those fired reportedly received a strange email. Your services are no longer required, effective immediately. No severance, no transition plan, just an institution dedicated to diplomacy getting wiped off the map faster than Trump's last brain cell during a deposition. Now, the lawsuit seeks to block Doge's latest move, arguing that you can't just throw an unqualified government efficiency bro into the leadership of a peace institute and hope for the best. U.S. District Judge Beryl Howell has scheduled a hearing for Tuesday, because apparently we still pretend there are legal limits to this madness. Meanwhile, the White House has gone radio silent, presumably because the press team is still in the fetal position from the last 800 controversies they had to pretend were totally normal. So what's next? Will Musk put a SpaceX intern in charge of the FDA? Replace the Library of Congress with X Premium subscriptions? At this point, nothing is off the table. And if peace itself can be privatized like gutting a failing startup, the only real question left is, what dystopian disaster do these lunatics have planned for tomorrow? The Trump administration has officially taken a flamethrower to clean energy funding because why invest in the future when you can just double down on choking the planet to death right now? The DOE has already axed 2 clean energy projects, including one that aimed to reduce energy consumption in low-income housing and another that studied EV car sharing programs. You know, pointless things like making life more affordable and not drowning coastal cities. Instead, Trump and his fossil fuel cronies have decided that renewables just don't align with their objectives, which is administration speak for not enough oil barons are getting richer off of it. Now, about 300 other clean energy products are up for review, meaning the DOE is basically lining up a firing squad for anything that doesn't involve drilling, fracking, or burning stuff at record-breaking levels. Critics, including Representative Marcy Kaptur, are pointing out the obvious consequences: higher energy costs, lost jobs, and a general plunge into environmental dystopia. But honestly, if you thought this administration cared about jobs or affordable energy, you haven't been paying attention. This isn't about energy independence or market forces. This is about squeezing every last drop of profit out of fossil fuels before the planet literally starts melting. Because God forbid we invest in renewables when we could just keep pumping oil like it's the 1950s and call it patriotism. The Trump administration is once again playing its favorite game of deport now, ask legal questions never, this time sending 17 people branded as gang members to El Salvador via U.S. military transport. Because a fair judicial process is when you throw people on a plane with a vague, they're criminals, just trust us explanation. This round of deportations included gang members of Venezuela's Tren de Agua and MS-13, but with the administration's track record, gang member could just mean wrong accent, wrong neighborhood, wrong documentation. Secretary of State Lowell Marco, the lightweight choker, conveniently declined to clarify what legal authority was used to justify this latest purge, which probably means they don't have one. In the past, the administration tried using the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 because apparently upholding democracy is dusting off 18th century xenophobia. The ACLU immediately challenged it in court, and shocker, the U.S. Court of Appeals blocked the whole thing. That didn't stop Trump from doing it anyway, declining to turn the plane around against the judge's orders and depriving migrants of the chance to claim persecution or torture because, hey, who needs human rights when you can just shove people onto a plane and call it security? Fortunately, a U.S. district judge has now slammed the brakes on this horror show, citing basic protections under the Convention Against Torture. That's right, things have gotten so bad that courts are having to remind the White House, hey, you're not actually allowed to send people to places where they'll be tortured. With the Trump administration declining to give a reason for most of these recent deportations, it seems that at this point they may be doing whatever they'd like and daring the court to enforce the law. Only time will tell whether they actually do. With an administration that sees human suffering as a policy win, this fight is far from over. The Trump family diving headfirst into the crypto world is like handing a match to an arsonist and acting shocked when everything burns down. In late 2024, they took over World Liberty Financial, a decentralized financial venture that somehow miraculously ended up entirely centralized under their control. Over the following months, WLF raked in a casual $550 million from investors who, apparently, had never heard of Trump University or Truth Social's stock market acrobatics. The official mission of WLF? Decentralized finance for the people. The actual mission? Decentralized finance for the Trumps. They secured 75% of net revenues from token sales and 60% of all the platform's profits, all while handing investors governance tokens that let them pretend to have a say, except these tokens don't include profit sharing and can't even be traded because a financial revolution is buying into a system where you have no power and no way out. Shockingly, and by shockingly I mean completely predictably, despite raising $500 million, WLF still hasn't launched its platform. But don't worry, development is ongoing, which in Trump speak means we're either grifting, stalling, or figuring out how to blame this collapse on immigrants. Meanwhile, the financial world is side-eyeing this entire operation like a Ponzi scheme with a gold-plated T on top, and experts are raising serious concerns about conflicts of interest. Let's be real, when the sitting president's family is directly profiting from an unregulated financial scheme, you don't need to be a crypto expert to see where this is headed. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has a message for Donald Trump. Try it and see what happens. This warning comes after Trump's latest foreign policy masterpiece, an ultimatum demanding Iran sign a new nuclear deal within 2 months or else. And by or else, he means the thing he threatens every country with, bombs, because nothing says great deal maker like holding an entire nation hostage. Khamenei made it clear that Iran has no intention of playing Trump's game, stating that any act of aggression by the US will be met met with a strong blow. Now, for those unfamiliar with the history of the US-Iran relations, here's a quick recap. Iran was actually following the 2015 nuclear deal like a kid trying to impress their strict parents, and everything was fine. Then Trump, fueled by spite and whatever Fox News segment he had just watched, tore up the deal and slapped on brutal sanctions that tanked Iran's economy. Fast forward a few years, and now he's pretending to be surprised that Iran isn't excited to negotiate under the threat of airstrikes. Iran took the mature route and responded through Switzerland's embassy, the diplomatic equivalent of using a mediator in couples therapy, while the US is outside throwing rocks out the window and yelling, "Come out and fight me." And of course, Western officials are once again freaking out about Iran's nuclear program, insisting they must be secretly making weapons, because obviously, after watching the US backstab them on the last deal, Iran should totally trust America again. It's like stealing someone's lunch, punching them in the face, and then demanding they lend you money. It's almost impressive. Trump tears up a nuclear deal that was actually working, cripples Iran's economy with sanctions, and then demands they come crawling back to sign a new deal under the threat of bombs. And when Iran says, yeah, no, he starts chest thumping about military action like a guy who just lost a bar fight but is still yelling, "Hold me back." This entire crisis is one of America's own making. The US broke the deal, lied about why, and now expects Iran to crawl back to the table under the threat of military force. One thing is clear. With Trump's deadline ticking down, we're about to see whether this is just more blustery saber rattling, or if Trump is actually deranged enough to ignite another catastrophe in the Middle East. If there's one thing the Trump administration loves more than corporate tax cuts and undermining democracy, it's gutting public health infrastructure right before a crisis. In a move that screams deja vu, Trump's latest round of mass layoffs at U.S. health agencies has conveniently included the people responsible for handling the nation's response to bird flu. Yeah, you heard that right. The government just fired the experts managing the ongoing viral outbreak because apparently America hasn't learned a single lesson from COVID-19. The result? Chaos, obviously. The bird flu has already wiped out nearly 170 million birds, scrambled the egg market, and put the entire poultry industry on edge. And now, thanks to these brilliant layoffs, the agencies tasked with keeping it contained are hemorrhaging staff. But don't worry, Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. assures us that this is just an effort to streamline operations and reduce bureaucracy. Effective governance is axing the very people standing between us and the next pandemic, I guess. The Agricultural Department, which apparently didn't get the memo that the end goal is total dysfunction, is scrambling to rehire some of the very same workers that were just laid off. Some of these firings were so disastrous that a federal agency had to step in and say, wait, no, this is actually a terrible idea. And let's not forget, this is all happening under an administration that still can't decide whether science is real. Between RFK Jr.'s conspiratorial nonsense and Trump's general disdain for public health, we're looking at a government that fundamentally does not care if people live or die, as long as it can trim a few government salaries and funnel more cash towards the military. If the last pandemic proved anything, it's that we need more funding for public health, not less. But instead, we're getting mass firings of disease experts, all because Trump's administration thinks science is just an expensive hobby for nerds. So what happens next? Well, the bird flu won't wait for the government to get its act together. Without the necessary personnel, outbreaks could spread further. Food supplies could take even bigger hits. And if we're really lucky, the virus could even mutate to start infecting more humans. But hey, at least we're cutting down on bureaucracy, right? This incompetence isn't just predictable, it's deliberate. The Trump administration has never cared about public health, and if we're about to get another pandemic, their only response will be the same as the last time: deny, deflect, and blame everyone else while people die. In a heartwarming display of government efficiency, ICE managed to accidentally deport Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, a legally protected Maryland resident, to one of the most violent prisons in the world. They later said this was an administrative error. This is state-sanctioned cruelty dressed up as an administrative error. That's what you call a typo in a DMV form, not the forced disappearance of a legally protected resident. But let's be real, this isn't a mistake. This is ICE doing what ICE does best: terrorizing immigrants with impunity and then shrugging when lives are destroyed. Mr. Garcia fled El Salvador as a child to escape gang violence. A judge, someone who actually interprets the law instead of trampling it, ruled that in 2019, sending him back would likely get him killed. But ICE doesn't care about legal protections. They care about fulfilling the bloodthirsty demands of an administration that treats immigrants as disposable. So they kidnapped him from his construction job because, God forbid, a hardworking immigrant be allowed to, live alive and shipped him straight to one of the most brutal prisons in the world. And then, as if the sheer horror of it all wasn't enough, they had the audacity to say, oops, our bad, while refusing to fix it. Because ICE isn't about protecting Americans or enforcing the law. It's about exerting unchecked power over vulnerable people. They claim Mr. Garcia has alleged gang affiliations, conveniently dragging out a vague, evidence-free accusation from a bond hearing in 2019. That's right, they don't need proof, just the magic words gang ties to justify throwing a man into a hellhole and washing their hands of it. And where's the accountability? Where's the outrage? ICE gets to destroy lives without consequence because the US treats immigrants' suffering as background noise, an inconvenient truth we can all ignore. This is the same government that will tell you to trust the system, while that very system throws innocent people into cages. The same country that loves to brag about its justice while using bureaucracy as a weapon to erase people. This isn't an accident. This is a feature of a system designed to dehumanize, brutalize, and erase people who don't fit in the white nationalist fantasy of who deserves to be here. Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia is just one name. How many others have been erased, disappeared, and discarded because ICE decided their lives weren't worth it? How many people have been condemned to death under the lie of, oops, we made a mistake? Because let's be honest, mistakes like this only ever seem to happen in one direction. This isn't just injustice. This is a crime, and ICE should be dismantled for it. The US Senate is currently engaged in a high-stakes game of do we listen to Trump or do we acknowledge reality? As Democrats push to reverse his tariffs on Canadian imports, these tariffs, imposed under the guise of stopping fentanyl trafficking because a war on drugs is taxing maple syrup, have managed to annoy just about everyone, including some Republicans who usually prefer their self-inflicted economic wounds a little less blatant. Leading the charge against this latest exercise in policy absurdity is Senator Tim Kaine, who, along with other Democrats, is arguing that maybe punishing Canada for America's opioid crisis isn't the smartest move. Meanwhile, GOP senators are doing their usual moral gymnastics routine. They admit the tariffs are hurting farmers, ranchers, and global markets, but they also don't want to anger Trump lest they be excommunicated from the cult. Senator Majority Leader John Thune gave a stunningly vague statement about tariffs being strategically useful for stopping drug trafficking, which is a bit like saying burning down your house is a great way to keep the burglars out. Meanwhile, Senator Steve Daines of Montana is deeply vigilant about how these tariffs affect agriculture, because nothing reassures struggling farmers more than a senator watching their financial ruin from a safe distance. And let's not forget Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, who's worried about uncertainty in global markets. Newsflash, when your party follows a guy who makes economic policy decisions the same way a toddler picks dinner, randomly and with no concern for consequences, you get uncertainty. Of course, even if the Senate manages to pass this resolution, it still has to survive the Republican-controlled House, where bills go to die unless they contain tax cuts for billionaires or new ways to criminalize poverty. In the meantime, American farmers, businesses, and consumers will just have to keep suffering for the sake of Trump's fragile ego. So will the GOP choose economic stability over loyalty to their orange overlord, or will they once again prove that they'd rather tank the economy than admit Trump doesn't know what the hell he's doing? Stay tuned for the next episode of Spineless Republicans, the never-ending saga. In the latest episode of America Solves Nothing, Just Punishes People, federal prosecutors have announced they will pursue the death penalty against Luigi Mangione, the 26-year-old accused of assassinating United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, because justice is responding to murder with a murder. This decision was personally greenlit by Attorney General Pam Bondi, riding high on President Trump's renewed enthusiasm for state-sponsored executions. Why fix the healthcare system when you can just kill people instead? Mangione, a highly educated Ivy League computer science graduate, apparently left behind some very pointed messages at the scene, making it clear that his fury wasn't just personal, it was the fury of many Americans. But instead of asking why a young, intelligent man might be driven to such extreme action, the government is just slapping on a terrorism charge and preparing the needle. So now the US government suddenly cares about human life. Funny, I don't remember federal prosecutors lining up to seek justice for the thousands of people United Healthcare has functionally executed by denying them medical care. Where was the national outrage when desperate patients were rationing insulin, skipping chemotherapy, or dying in emergency rooms after being told their treatment wasn't medically necessary? Where were the terrorism charges when United Healthcare knowingly let people die for profit? But the second someone fights back, really fights back, the state mobilizes its full force. Not when people suffer, not when families lose loved ones to corporate greed, but when one CEO finally faces consequences outside of a quarterly earnings report. That's when the government decides life is valuable. That's when it calls for blood. Luigi Luigi Mangione isn't some cartoon villain. He's a symptom of a system so broken, so brutally inhumane, that someone with every reason to succeed in life felt there was no other option. And instead of asking what drove him to that point, instead of confronting the sick dystopian reality of American healthcare, the state just shrugs and says, guess we better kill him too. And let's talk about that real quick. The death penalty. Like, really? As if this country hasn't already murdered enough people by withholding healthcare? As if executing Mangione will undo the actual terrorism United Healthcare and companies like it commit every single day? No. America's justice system only works to shield the powerful. No one's saying violence is the answer, but what do you expect in a country where the rich hoard life-saving resources and force the rest of us to suffer? Where your access to basic survival depends on how much money you can scrape together. You can only push people so far before they snap. And now the system wants to make an example out of Mangione, not to deliver justice, but to make sure no one else dares to push back. They don't want you angry. They don't want you thinking about real criminals who wear suits and sit in boardrooms deciding who lives and who dies based on profit margins. They want you to accept your suffering, to shut up and die quietly. Luigi Mangione didn't, and that scares the hell out of them. In an act of sheer will and possibly superhuman lung capacity, New Jersey Senator Cory Booker has spoken for over 21 straight hours, putting up a one-man roadblock against Trump's latest round of legislative horror. As I write this, he's still speaking now. While most Democrats prefer their resistance in the form of exasperated press releases and strongly worded letters, Booker decided to make his opposition impossible to ignore by doing what few politicians ever do, actually putting in the work. This wasn't just grandstanding, this was endurance-level political combat. Booker took to the floor Monday night and just kept going, long past the point where most people would have collapsed into a heap of filibustering exhaustion. He rallied against Trump's catastrophic plan to gut Social Security, a move that would leave millions of elderly Americans choosing between food and medicine. Because if there's one thing the GOP hates more than poor people, it's old poor people. Booker also had to address Trump's increasingly deranged foreign policy, which now includes serious discussions about annexing Greenland and Canada. Because apparently when you run out of domestic policies to ruin, the next logical step is full-blown imperialism. Despite every reason to feel exhausted, demoralized, and hopeless, Booker did not stop. He pulled strength from history invoking civil rights icons like John Lewis, because he knows this isn't just about one policy or one election, it's about the soul of the country. Booker's message was clear. History remembers those who fight. His Democratic colleagues helped out where they could, tossing him questions to let him catch his breath, probably slipping him caffeine off camera, and generally marveling at the fact that someone in their party was finally treating this moment with the urgency it deserves. This is what resistance is supposed to look like. Not just tweets, not sternly worded letters, but an all-out refusal to let this administration's cruelty slide by unnoticed. Booker's speech won't single-handedly stop Trump's policies. What it does do is remind Americans that there are still people willing to fight, to actually put their bodies, voices, and time on the line when it matters. And in a political landscape where so many Democrats seem content to play it safe, Booker just proved that the only way to confront rising fascism is to stand up and refuse to sit down. So here's to Cory Booker, the only politician in the Senate with the endurance to outlast a bad presidency in real time. May his voice hold out, because the country desperately needs more of this kind of fight. The Israeli government has done what it does best: starve, bomb, and deny while the world watches in horror. The United Nations World Food Program just announced the closure of the last remaining bakeries in Gaza, leaving millions of Palestinians with nothing to eat. Why? Because Israel's ongoing blockade has choked off food supplies to the point where even humanitarian aid organizations have been forced to throw up their hands and say there's nothing left. Meanwhile, Israel insists that it let in adequate food supplies during the 6-week truce. Well, if that's true, then where's the food? The UN is telling us they're out. Gaza's markets are empty. People are starving to death in real time. So either Israel is lying, or they've redefined adequate to mean just enough to keep people suffering, but not enough to keep them alive. And let's not forget, this isn't just some unfortunate side effect of the war. This is the war. Starvation is the policy. Systematic denial of food, water, and medicine isn't some regrettable accident. It's deliberate genocide. Israel bombs farms, blocks aid trucks, destroys water sources, and then acts surprised when people start dying en masse. That playbook hasn't changed. Push the Palestinians to the brink, force them into impossible conditions, and then blame them for ever existing at all. And as the bombs keep falling and Israel prepares yet another ground invasion, what's the world doing? Begging for a ceasefire that Israel has made clear it will never honor? Calling for restraint as an entire population is starved into submission? But let's be real, if this were happening anywhere else, if millions of civilians were being systematically starved by a Western designated enemy state, the outrage wouldn't just be be moral, it would be military. Gaza is being suffocated before our eyes, and what's our country's response? A mix of hand-wringing, empty statements, and unconditional aid to the people responsible. How many more bodies have to pile up before the world stops pretending it's just a conflict and calls it what it is, a genocide? In what can only be described as a preemptive strike against public health, the US government has decided that science is a luxury we can no longer afford. Up to 10,000 employees across the NIH, FDA, and CDC have been laid off, ensuring that the next pandemic won't just be deadly, it'll be a complete surprise. This catastrophic decision-making is the brainchild of Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a man best known for believing Wi-Fi is a biological weapon. He's consolidating these agencies into something called the Administration for a Healthy America, a name that screams, we fired the experts, but trust us, everything's fine. The layoffs come courtesy of President Donald Trump, who in a stunning act of cruelty disguised as efficiency, decided that federal health workers didn't need collective bargaining rights or jobs. Now the people who regulate food safety, research deadly diseases, and track outbreaks will have plenty of time to reflect on how they should have gone into public service in a country with a sane government. State and local health departments are also bleeding out thanks to COVID-19 relief funds drying up. So if you were hoping your community might still have a functioning health system, that's adorable. A coalition of state attorneys general is suing the administration, arguing that dismantling public health infrastructure might, just might, have negative consequences. Bold take. With fewer scientists, researchers, and regulators standing between you and a public health apocalypse, it's time to start brushing up on your 14th century survival skills. Boil your water, avoid strangers, burn the bodies before the rats get them. Oh, and if your meat smells weird, just eat it anyways. There's no FDA left to recall it. Just when you thought the Trump administration had hit its quota for gutting public health, here comes another round of needless suffering, sponsored by the government. A coalition of Democratic-led senators is now suing to stop Trump from slashing $11 billion in health grants, money that was keeping infectious disease programs, mental health services, and addiction treatment afloat. Because if there's one thing Trump and his cronies hate more than basic human decency, it's funding anything that helps people survive. The lawsuit, filed in Rhode Island, makes a pretty simple argument. You can't just strip away billions in health funding and expect people not to die. But of course, Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. insists this money is no longer necessary because the pandemic is over. Yes, the classic Republican strategy of pretending a crisis disappears the moment it's no longer politically convenient. Never mind the fact that COVID-19 left a wreckage of mental health crises, addiction spikes, and an overburdened healthcare system still dealing with the long-term effects. In RFK Jr.'s magical world, once the news cycle moves on, the consequences just vanish into thin air. And let's talk about what these funds were actually supporting. Addiction treatment? Gone. Disease prevention programs? Slashed. Mental health services? Absolutely not, you weaklings. The cuts even hit the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Because if there's one thing this administration excels at, it's making sure the country is as sick and unstable as possible. What's even more infuriating is the sheer pettiness of it all. This isn't about saving money. If the government really cared about the budget, maybe they'd take a look at the bloated military-industrial complex or the endless corporate tax breaks, or literally any other part of the federal spending that doesn't involve keeping vulnerable people alive. But no, the first thing to always go is public health, because there's no immediate profit in it. So now, states are forced to sue just to keep their own citizens from spiraling into avoidable suffering, and the Trump administration, they'll fight tooth and nail to strip every last dollar, because nothing makes them happier than making life as cruel as possible for the people they're supposed to serve. If this lawsuit fails, the consequences will be deadly, but don't expect Trump or RFK Jr. to care. After all, their real healthcare plan has always been the same. Let the weak die off and call it fiscal responsibility. In the latest episode of Destroy Everything and Call It Reform, the Trump administration has abolished the U.S. Department of Education, because if there's one thing authoritarian regimes hate, it's an educated population that can think for itself. And for an extra kick of cruelty, they've also thrown the $1.6 trillion student loan system into the lap of the Small Business Administration, an agency that knows as much about student loans as Trump knows about reading. So what's the result? Absolute financial chaos for students, law schools, and anyone who is planning to go to college without being born into wealth. Nearly half of the education department staff is being laid off, while the SBA, already understaffed, is somehow supposed to take over managing millions of student loans. The obvious consequence? Delays, incompetence, and a whole lot of students getting financially wrecked. Law school deans are sounding the alarm because their entire tuition model relies on students accessing federal loans. But with the SBA fumbling the bag, students may be forced to take out high-interest private loans or drop out altogether. This isn't just about law students, though. If the SBA can't handle basic disbursements, expect similar chaos across all higher education. What's better than skyrocketing tuition costs? Skyrocketing tuition costs plus predatory private lenders. And let's not forget the real goal here: making college unaffordable for working class people. The Republican dream is an education system where rich kids go to elite schools and poor kids get stuck with underfunded trade programs if they get anything at all, and student debt becomes an even bigger financial trap than it already is. This isn't about efficiency or cutting bureaucracy. This is about making sure higher education is a privilege for the wealthy and a lifelong debt sentence for anyone else. After all, an educated public asks questions, fights for its rights, and worst of all, votes against fascists. And we all know Trump can't have that. Surprise, surprise. Russia has rejected Trump's so-called peace proposal on Ukraine, proving once again that Moscow has no real interest in ending this war until Ukraine no longer exists as an independent nation. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybkov claims that the US plan doesn't address the root cause of the war, which in Kremlin speak means it doesn't let Putin take Ukraine and call it a day. According to the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Moscow takes the American proposal seriously, which is diplomatic code for we skimmed the email and laughed, but says they failed to address the root causes of the war, which if you ask Putin, means Ukraine still exists as an independent country. The Kremlin wants Kiev to agree to a laundry list of humiliating conditions, including giving up 4 occupied regions, abandoning NATO membership forever, and downsizing its military. You know, just in case Russia gets bored and wants to roll in again. Unsurprisingly, Ukraine sees this as an outright demand for surrender. Meanwhile, Trump is reportedly frustrated with Putin. Yes, the man who spent years kissing the Kremlin's boots is now shocked that Russia isn't playing nice. So what's Trump's big counter move? Threatening secondary sanctions on countries buying Russian oil, because clearly the best way to negotiate peace is to start an economic fight with half the planet. Brilliant strategy, really. At this point, it's painfully obvious what this peace deal was. It was never about Ukraine's sovereignty or security. It's about Trump trying to score a quick photo op ceasefire where he can act like he solved a crisis that he fundamentally does not understand. He wants a deal where Ukraine is told to roll over, Russia gets to keep what it stole, and the war gets wrapped up neatly. But here's the thing, Russia doesn't even respect Trump enough to take the bait. They know they can stall and push for more concessions, and why wouldn't they? The Trump administration has already shown he's perfectly happy gutting NATO, cutting aid to Ukraine, and giving Putin everything he wants on a silver platter. Ukraine gets hung out to dry, and Russia keeps pushing for total domination. But sure, let's keep pretending that a man who thinks Finland is part of Russia is capable of complex diplomacy. The Wisconsin Supreme Court has officially defended itself from conservative hands, and the right-wing establishment is spiraling into existential dread. Thanks to Judge Susan Crawford's victory, the court now continues to lean liberal, threatening to do unthinkable things like letting people have bodily autonomy, protecting workers from corporate overlords, and ensuring elections reflect actual votes instead of GOP fever dreams. Crawford, a longtime advocate for democracy and therefore naturally a sworn enemy of the Republican Party, crushed conservative Brad Schmiel despite his glowing endorsements from Donald Trump and Elon Musk, the dream team of tax-dodging billionaires and insurrection enthusiasts. The GOP poured cash into the race, but it turns out that even Musk can't quite buy a functioning democracy, even if he tried to pay people to do it. With Crawford on the bench, the court has already put a stop to some of Wisconsin's finest examples of voter suppression, including bans on absentee ballot drop boxes. Next up, redrawing legislative maps to actually reflect where people live, rather than a GOP-crafted Rorschach test of gerrymandered nonsense. Also on the docket, abortion rights, meaning Wisconsin Republicans might soon have to find a new hobby besides forcing people to give birth. Of course, conservative leaders are devastated. After all, if the courts keep siding with voters instead of billionaires, Wisconsin might one day be a state where democracy functions and nothing scares them more. Republicans have once again triumphed in Florida, proving that in the Sunshine State, all you need to win an election is a pulse and an R next to your name. And of course, Donald Trump whispering sweet nothings about you on Truth Social. But this time, the margins were tighter than Matt Gaetz' legal defense fund. Jimmy Patronis, Florida's chief financial officer and part-time Trump hype man, managed to fend off Democrat Gay Valmont in the 1st District, aka Gaetz' old stomping grounds, presumably now available for rent on Airbnb. Meanwhile, Randy Fine claimed victory in the 6th District, taking over from Mike Waltz, who left to serve as Trump's national security advisor, because somehow a secure nation is a guy who can't even keep an encrypted chat secure. Despite these wins, Republicans are sweating more than Ron DeSantis in a room full of human emotions. The margins were significantly slimmer than past elections, suggesting that even in deep red Florida, voters might be getting just a little tired of the endless circus. Democrats, with their fancy campaign funding and voter mobilization, managed to make the GOP work harder than usual, something they historically prefer to avoid. Still, both Petronas and Fine credited their victories to Trump's endorsement, proving that the president's grip on Florida remains strong. But with the GOP's once monolithic dominance showing cracks, Republicans might soon need a new strategy beyond just pointing at Democrats and yelling socialism. Trump has once again issued a decree from his golden toilet, or maybe the Oval Office. It's hard to tell apart at this point, considering he's crapping all over democracy. He is demanding that Senate Republicans fall in line and oppose the resolution that would nullify his latest economic tantrum. I mean, tariffs on Canadian imports justified under the time-honored principle of making stuff up. The former president claims these tariffs are necessary because Canada is supposedly slacking on fentanyl control, despite actual data showing that most fentanyl seizures happen at the US-Mexico border. But while it facts get in the way of a good trade war, tariffing Canada, America's polite upstairs neighbors, makes just as much sense as blaming your microwave for climate change. But Trump insists it's the only way to stop drug cartels who definitely aren't moving product via the northern border. The Senate is now set to vote on whether to shut this nonsense down, with a few rogue Republicans, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Mitch McConnell, and Rand Paul flirting with the radical idea of governing based on reality. If they side with the Democrats, the resolution could pass the Senate, but it would still need to survive the House, where GOP lawmakers remain locked in a competition to see who can be the most obedient to Trump's whims. In the meantime, business groups and economists are screaming into the void about how these tariffs will hurt American consumers, drive up costs, and damage trade relations. But Republicans remain hopeful that they can negotiate something better later, presumably after Trump gets bored and moves on to declaring war on Denmark over Greenland. Just when you thought economic policy couldn't get any more unhinged, Donald Trump has decided to bless us all with Liberation Day, a grand new scheme that will slap massive tariffs on imports like automobiles, steel, aluminum, pharmaceuticals, and computer chips. The idea? Force countries like China, Canada, Mexico, and the EU to play fair in trade. The reality, though? A self-inflicted economic migraine that will send prices soaring, businesses scrambling, and international allies wondering when America will implode. In classic Trump fashion, his administration is pitching this as a genius-level economic win, claiming it will generate a staggering $600 billion a year. What they aren't mentioning is that this also qualifies as one of the biggest tax hikes since World War II. Yeah, a tax hike from the man who built his entire political brand on whining about taxes. But don't worry, it's not like working-class Americans are going to be the one paying for it all, right? Oh wait, they totally are. Because here's the thing about tariffs. They aren't paid for by foreign governments. They're paid by you. Every car, every can of beer, every prescription drug, every phone or laptop, expect them all to get more expensive. And for what? So Trump can cosplay as a tough-on-trade nationalist while businesses hemorrhage money and trading partners retaliate? Brilliant. Great job. Really amazing. Thumbs up. Economists who must be getting really tired of yelling about this stuff are already waving giant red flags. History and basic math tell us that trade wars don't end well, especially when your strategy is essentially punch yourself in the face and call it strength. If Trump's goal was to tank the stock market, hike inflation, and make it harder for American companies to compete globally, then congratulations, mission accomplished. And yet some Republicans are still doing their usual awkward dance of reluctant support, hoping this somehow works out despite all available evidence saying it won't. Because let's face it, none of them want to be on the wrong side of Trump's next angry Truth Social meltdown. Meanwhile, businesses are left in a state of absolute uncertainty, wondering if they should start stockpiling goods now or just accept the fact that the next few years will be a financial dumpster fire. Liberation Day isn't about liberating the economy. It's about liberating Trump from the need for a coherent policy while his supporters cheer for their own financial misery. If this is the future of American trade, we better get used to fighting over the cheapest cup of noodles. In another totally normal legal battle over whether a president can just mass fire thousands of people for no reason, U.S. District Judge James Bredner has doubled down on his previous ruling, now making it crystal clear the Trump administration's great federal worker purge was as legally sound as a Facebook conspiracy post. This latest ruling means that the restatement order applies to 19 states and Washington, D.C. They were the ones that had the audacity to say, hey, maybe illegally firing 24,000 people isn't great for the economy because Surprise, when you dump thousands of workers into unemployment with no warning, states are left holding the bag, paying out benefits while scrambling to fix the mess. Who could have predicted that? Literally everyone except the people running this administration. Or maybe they could, I don't even know. Trump's team insists that these mass firings were all about performance, which is a fun way of saying we just wanted to gut the federal workforce because government bad. The administration is now appealing the ruling to the 4th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, and if that doesn't work, the Supreme Court, because a small government is when you drag your terrible ideas through as many taxpayer-funded legal battles as possible. Unfortunately, the workers affected by this mess are caught in bureaucratic limbo, waiting to see if they'll get their jobs back, or if they're just collateral damage in yet another Trump-era crusade against, well, anything that functions. The reinstatement process is underway, but this case is likely going to be punted around the legal system for a while, because if there's one thing the modern GOP loves more than pretending to be pro-worker, it's finding new and creative ways to make sure workers actually have fewer rights. So for now, the courts are saying you can't just fire thousands of people because you feel like it, and the administration is screaming, watch us try anyway. Stay tuned for the next thrilling episode of Can the Government Function for 5 Minutes Without a Lawsuit? God bless America, where justice is blind, but only if you can afford the right lawyers, political connections, or strategic alliances with a twice-impeached current sitting president. In the latest episode of The Rich and Powerful People Get Away With It, U.S. District Judge Dale Ho has officially torpedoed the corruption case against New York City Mayor Eric Adams, handing him a dismissal with prejudice. And the reason? Oh, just the mild suggestion that the Justice Department was more interested in securing Adams' political loyalty than actually enforcing the law. Apparently, the best way to get away with alleged bribery and illegal campaign contributions is to position yourself as a useful pawn in Trump's war on immigrants. Why go through the hassle of proving innocence when you can just be politically valuable? Adams was accused of taking shady campaign money and doing favors for a Turkish official while serving as Brooklyn Borough president, something that would normally land an average citizen in handcuffs, but for Adams, it just resulted in a few awkward press conferences and a minor PR headache. The Justice Department then swept in like a political cleanup crew, nuked the case from orbit, and caused such internal chaos that multiple prosecutors resigned in protest. That's not just a legal ruling, that's a full-blown political hostage situation. And Adams? Oh, he's relieved. Of course he is. Who wouldn't be thrilled to walk away scot-free from a corruption case with a lifetime guarantee that it can never be reopened? He's now out here talking about regaining public trust as if it's just another minor scandal to brush off before the next awful thing he does. Because in the grand tradition of American politics, actually earning public trust is optional. What really matters is whether enough people are tired, broke, or distracted to forget why they hated you in the first place. The lesson here? It's not about guilt or innocence. It's about who benefits from your survival. And right now, Adams isn't just a free man, he's a free asset. In today's episode of Billionaire Accountability is a Myth, a Pennsylvania man is suing Elon Musk and his America PAC for allegedly stiffing him on payments for gathering petition signatures in 2024. The lawsuit, filed by John Doe, which is fitting considering how many people Musk probably prefers to remain nameless and unpaid, claims he was promised $100 per signature or referral, but instead got hourly wages because free market capitalism is suddenly switching to wage labor when it benefits the boss. Doe, who says he's out over $20,000, is seeking class action status, meaning Musk may have shorted more than one poor soul who believed in his weird, unique brand of free speech, also known as paying people to promote his interests, then ghosting them. It makes sense because Musk's idea of innovation is reinventing wage theft. Let's be real, expecting Musk to treat workers fairly is like expecting him to build a functional hyperloop. Sounds good in a tweet, but in reality, it's just a giant vacuum of broken promises. Of course, America PAC is claiming they've spent millions on canvassers, but they reserve the right to withhold payment if they suspect fraud, which is rich considering Musk himself is basically the king of vaporware, overpromising and under-delivering since PayPal. How many Teslas are still spontaneously combusting? How's that self-driving tech working out? And let's not even start on Twitter, which he turned into a right-wing hellscape faster than you can say free speech absolutist. But none of this is new. Musk has always been a guy who pretends to be a champion of the people while squeezing workers, dodging accountability, instability and cosplaying as some kind of Tony Stark genius. Except Tony Stark actually built things that worked. From union busting at Tesla to turning Twitter into a safe space for conspiracy theorists, everything Musk touches somehow ends up a bigger mess than it started. And now he's dabbling in election schemes, stiffing people on wages, and playing political kingmaker for Trump's second act. Apparently, 2016 wasn't dystopian enough. The only thing more predictable than Musk's grift is the fact that no matter how many times he does this, there will still be fanboys and fascists lining up to defend him. Yeah, another day, another euphemism for genocide. This time, Netanyahu is unveiling his latest war crime under the branding of a security corridor, because when you're forcibly displacing an entire population, it's important to give it a name that sounds like it came from a dystopian city planning committee. This so-called Morag corridor is the newest Israeli land grab, cutting across Gaza to further choke and isolate what's left of its population. The goal? To tighten the noose on Rafah, where over 1 million Palestinians have been herded like cattle after being bombed out of every other city they once called home. It's a textbook siege tactic. Starve them, displace them, trap them, then pretend it's all about security. Meanwhile, Israel's military continues its indiscriminate slaughter, with 40 more Palestinians killed in airstrikes, including women and children. And just to make sure absolutely no one is safe, they also bombed a UN facility because why not? At this point, Netanyahu's government has made it clear that international law is just a suggestion they will not hear. Unsurprisingly, Israel justifies this with the same tired excuses. Hamas won't release hostages, so we must flatten an entire region. Never mind that over 30,000 Palestinians have already been killed, most of them civilians. Never mind that 60% of Gaza is now uninhabitable. Never mind that the so-called most moral army in the world has spent months systematically wiping out entire neighborhoods while the West wrings its hands and does absolutely nothing. This isn't about security, this is ethnic cleansing. It is genocide, and Netanyahu knows that as long as the US keeps sending weapons and shielding Israel from consequences, he can keep pushing Gaza's people into the abyss. The question is, how much more horror will the world stomach before it finally says enough? How much longer can the world lie to itself? Making America great again is when you gut early childhood education for low-income children. Trump's administration, in its never-ending war against anything that helps people who aren't billionaires, kicked things off with a federal grant freeze for Head Start, a program that serves over 500,000 children from struggling families. The result? Nearly 24 preschool centers temporarily shut down, throwing vulnerable families into chaos. Oh, but don't worry, it gets worse. Even after the grant freeze was lifted, mass layoffs at the Department of Health and Human Services have left the program hanging by a thread. Preschool directors don't even know who to contact for grant-related questions because, well, there's no one left to answer the phone. Bureaucratic nightmare? Absolutely. Deliberate slow-motion sabotage of a program that primarily helps poor families? Also absolutely. Advocacy groups are sounding the alarm as Trump's budget cuts threaten to starve Head Start into irrelevance, which, if I'm being honest, is probably the point. After all, why invest in poor kids' education when you can redirect those funds towards tax breaks for corporations and bloated military spending? Why bother giving poor people a shot at a decent education? This isn't just budgetary negligence, it's a calculated attack on public services that actually work. The GOP's dream is to turn every functioning government program into a bureaucratic corpse, privatize what's left, and sell it off to the highest bidder. And if that means throwing thousands of children, teachers, and families into uncertainty, well, in the words of the conservative elite, should have been born rich. The GOP's greatest hits: tax cuts for the rich, austerity for the poor, and absolutely no plan to pay for any of it. Senate Republicans are now pushing forward Trump's $4.5 trillion tax cut package, because apparently we haven't learned anything from the last round of trickle-down economics that never actually trickled down. The latest grift includes $2 trillion in cuts to healthcare and other vital programs, because fiscal responsibility is when you make sure billionaires keep their tax loopholes while gutting services for people who actually need them. And just to make things extra fun, they're punting on the whole "how do we actually pay for this" question, because that's a problem for future America, or more accurately, future working class Americans who inevitably will foot the bill. Republicans, though, are having a minor family squabble over just how much suffering they should impose. The Senate is taking the "let's pretend we're not totally gutting social services" approach, while the House Republicans are just going full "let's torch the safety net and see what happens" mode. Either way, the end result is clear: massive handouts to corporations and the ultra-rich, paired with a slow-motion demolition of government programs that actually help ordinary people. Democrats, of course, are pointing out the obvious, that this is just another casino-style giveaway to the wealthy masquerading as tax reform, but since the GOP's economic strategy has always been to squeeze the working class, give the rich yet another yacht and call it freedom, their objections will likely be ignored. All this happening under President Trump 2.0, a man whose 2017 tax cuts already supercharged wealth inequality and ballooned the deficit. At this point, the GOP's economic strategy is basically rob the poor, pay the rich, and let the next generation deal with the fallout. And unfortunately, they're very, very good at it. Wall Street just got a taste of Trump's economic genius, like a toddler taste testing bleach. The Dow Jones Industrial Average took a 1,412-point swan dive. That's 3.3% for the nerds. The S&P 500 nosedived 4%, and the Nasdaq collapsed faster than Trump's casino empire, dropping 5.1%. Meanwhile, the Russell 2000, which tracks small businesses, got so wrecked it officially entered bear market territory, because helping the little guy is when you light their investments on fire. So what's the cause of this financial disaster? Trump decided that tariffs were a great idea, slapping at least a 10% tax on imports with even worse rates for China and the EU. Why have a functioning economy when you can just start a trade war instead, I guess? The move immediately triggered fears of inflation and recession, with UBS analysts warning this brain-dead policy could shrink GDP by 2% and push inflation up 5%. This means the Federal Reserve is now being begged to cut interest rates, except they can't because inflation is already gnawing at the economy like a rat in a McDonald's dumpster. Don't worry, America isn't suffering alone though. International markets followed suit, plummeting like a lead balloon. European and Asian stocks got their teeth kicked in, while investors ditched anything risky, tech, retail, or transportation, like they were running from a burning building. Even traditional safe havens like gold took a hit, because when Trump torches the global economy, he doesn't leave survivors. This is just the art of the deal in action, right? First you wreck the economy, then you tell everyone only you can fix it, and if that doesn't work, just blame China, the Fed, or hell, maybe even wind turbines again. Today I learned staple leadership is when you gut your own National Security Council because you suspect they aren't loyal enough to your personal brand of chaos. President Trump, taking inspiration from every two-bit dictator in history, has begun cleansing the NSC of officials who failed the ultimate loyalty test, meaning they still have functional critical thinking skills. In Trump's America, national security isn't about protecting the country, it's about protecting his fragile ego. This all started when far-right conspiracy theorist Laura Loomer waltzed into the Oval Office and presented her deep research, unhinged social media posts on why Trump's security team was packed with dangerous neocons. Now, the term neocon in this context doesn't mean what it used to. It no longer refers to interventionalist conservatives. It just means anyone who read a book once and disagreed with Trump. Loomer's ranting was enough to convince Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and Presidential Personnel Director Sergio Gore to go full-on Stalin mode and start purging the ranks. At least 3 senior NSC officials and a handful of aides were sent packing, presumably for the crime of understanding national security better than a guy who thinks you can nuke hurricanes. This all comes on the heels of Waltz, who now on thin ice himself, facing backlash for using the Signal app to coordinate a sensitive military operation in Yemen, only to have details of said secret mission conveniently end up in the inbox of journalist Jeffrey Goldberg, which of course makes perfect sense in an administration where secrecy is for tax returns but not actual military operations. And then there's Assistant U.S. Attorney Adam Schlafer, who was just living his life when Loomer decided to turn him into her next obsession. One deranged social media post later and poof, he was gone. Because that's how the government works now. Not through any kind of structured legal process, not through performance evaluations or ethical considerations, but through the whims of a conspiracy theorist who used to chain herself to big tech offices for attention. We're now running the country like a right-wing Orwellian Reddit forum with moderators banning people for thought crimes while the rest of us watch the chaos unfold. The White House has declined to comment. What would they even say? Yes, the president is turning the federal government into a paranoia-fueled loyalty test, and no, we don't plan to stop. At this point, we've abandoned all pretense of running a democracy. The executive branch is just a live-action reality show where Trump gets to play God, Laura Loomer is his top advisor, and the National Security Council is being replaced with a magic 8-ball and the lady that runs the libs of TikTok account. If you thought the first Trump term was a mess, welcome to the sequel, where conspiracy theorists aren't just cheering from the sidelines, they're running the whole damn show. If you thought watching Marco Rubio struggle during a debate was painful, wait until you see him try to reassure NATO that the US isn't about to ghost the alliance like a deadbeat dad. Lil Marco, the lightweight choker, somehow Secretary of State, because merit is a foreign concept in Trump's America, just wrapped up a NATO meeting in Brussels, where he attempted to calm the nerves of European allies who have been watching Trump's foreign policy the way one watches a drunk uncle try to parallel park, with a mix of terror and morbid curiosity. Standing next to newly minted US Ambassador to NATO, Matt Whitaker, the guy whose main qualification is once running a fraudulent patent scam, Lil Marco puts on his best serious face and assures everyone that America is totally still committed to NATO, as long as they do whatever Trump wants. He insisted that the US is actively engaged in strengthening the alliance, provided of course that European members enhance their capabilities, which is diplomatic code for stop making Trump mad or he'll start stomping his feet. Whitaker, eager to prove he belongs in the big leagues, chimed in with the usual NATO is strong under Trump nonsense, while simultaneously pushing the administration's favorite talking point, equitable burden sharing, which in Trump speak means we might abandon you at any moment, so good luck fighting Russia without us. While Lil Marco, the lightweight choker, might be doing his best to sell this as business as usual, NATO allies aren't buying it. It turns out people tend to get a little nervous when the sitting US president spends more time lavishing praise on Putin than he does reassuring European allies. Trump's unique approach to diplomacy, threatening allies with tariffs while cozying up to autocrats, has left NATO scrambling to figure out how to keep the alliance from falling apart without provoking the Orange Menace into rage quitting it entirely. The real panic, of course, is over Trump's reckless half-baked threats about pulling US troops out of Europe. Yeah, that's a strong military strategy to suddenly decide to pack up and leave just as Russia continues to eyeball the rest of Eastern Europe like a buffet. NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte is now in the unenviable position of trying to keep the US engaged without setting off one of Trump's famous temper tantrums. An act of diplomacy so delicate it might as well be classified performance art. Meanwhile, European countries are reluctantly accepting that they might soon have to handle their own security without America, as Trump's shifting strategic priorities continue to leave them in the lurch. So while Lil Marco, the lightweight choker, desperately tries to keep up the illusion that everything is fine, NATO leaders are already drawing up contingency plans for a post-American alliance, because at this rate, Trump might just hand Europe over to Putin in exchange for a nice hotel in Moscow. At this point, the only surprising thing about Benjamin Netanyahu being embroiled in yet another scandal is that it wasn't already obvious. The man collects corruption charges like Pokemon cards, and this time his inner circle got busted allegedly pocketing Qatari cash to run a PR campaign for the Gulf state. Yeah, you heard that right. While Netanyahu has been busy bulldozing Gaza, his closest advisors were apparently cashing checks from Qatar to make their client look good in Israel. And you have to ask, was this supposed to be pro bono PR work, or did they throw in a kill a few thousand more civilians bonus package? Senior aides Donaton Urich and Eli Fieldstein are now facing the consequences. Well, as much as anyone ever faces consequences in Netanyahu's orbit for allegedly orchestrating a media campaign to sell Qatar as a trustworthy mediator in Gaza peace talks, because that's exactly what the Middle East needs right now. More shadowy backroom deals that make it even less clear who's screwing who. But this wasn't just about making Qatar look good, it was also about undercutting Egypt's role in negotiations, because apparently it's not enough to massacre civilians, you also have to make sure your preferred business partners get top billing in whatever dystopian geopolitical theater you're staging. Attorney General Gali Baharav Miara has now launched a criminal investigation, and the Shin Bet is getting involved, which means this isn't some petty little slap on the wrist. We're talking about serious corruption, though let's be real, in Israel's government that's less of a crime and more of a job requirement. Netanyahu has already provided a statement to the police, which probably consisted of him mumbling witch hunt between bites of a taxpayer-funded steak dinner. The man's playbook is thinner than Israel's excuse for bombing refugee camps. And let's just talk about the optics here. Netanyahu's government has spent months slaughtering Palestinians under the guise of defense, reducing Gaza to rubble, while screaming about existential threats, and while all of that was happening, his closest aides were allegedly making side deals to help one of the countries supposedly funding Hamas cost to improve its public image. Make it make sense. The same people who frame every Palestinian child as an enemy combatant had no problem taking money from a Gulf state that's been accused of supporting militants so long as the check cleared. Israel continues to operate like a rogue state, committing war crimes in broad daylight while Western leaders trip over themselves to defend the indefensible. The US keeps sending weapons, the media keeps running Israeli propaganda unchallenged, and Netanyahu, despite being one of the most openly corrupt leaders on the planet, just keeps getting away with it. So, is this Qatar scandal the thing that finally takes him down? Probably not. He's like a cockroach, immune to accountability, thriving in filth and guaranteed to outlast whatever shred of morality his country used to pretend it had. But the walls are closing in. The Israeli public is losing patience. The world is watching in disgust, and even Netanyahu's most loyal cronies are starting to turn on him. Sooner or later, something's gotta give. And if it's not this scandal, it'll be the next one. Because if there's one thing you can count on with Netanyahu, it's that the corruption never stops coming. Well, look who just flipped the script and declared himself an independent candidate for New York City mayor. Eric Adams, the ex-cop turned neoliberal surveillance enthusiast, is skipping the Democratic primary because he knows he'd get absolutely wrecked. But don't be fooled, this isn't some bold act of political independence, it's a desperate survival move, likely hand-delivered by Donald Trump himself. You see, Adams was drowning in a federal bribery case, something about illegal donations and favors from Turkish officials, a case that had magically disappeared when Trump's Justice Department took over. The official story? They dropped it so Adams could cooperate on immigration policy. The real story? Trump just bought himself a New York asset. Adams is running as an independent, not because he's rejecting the two-party system, but because he's got a brand new donor class, Trump's people. MAGA elites love a good political puppet, and Adams just got the strings attached. He's been a disaster for working-class New Yorkers, but that's exactly why the Republican establishment is suddenly warming up to him. Think about it. Trump gets to keep NYC in chaos, Adams does his dirty work under the guise of centrism, and right-wing billionaires funnel cash into his campaign. In return, Adams gets protection, a fat campaign war chest, and another shot at a term without having to face an actual Democrat in the primary. And if he wins, expect policies straight out of the GOP playbook: more police, more corporate handouts, and a whole lot of stop resisting energy for marginalized communities. This isn't a man breaking free of the system, this is a man being reassigned. His common middle rhetoric is just a rebrand for Republican light authoritarianism, and New Yorkers better wake up before Trump's new favorite mayor gets another 4 years to play surveillance state emperor. It looks like the Pentagon's mid-level officials are the latest to get tossed under the Trump bus right after America's credibility and whatever's left of its global leadership. Senator Roger Wicker, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and apparently the last Republican willing to pretend they care about foreign policy, just went off on the Defense Department for allegedly trying to reduce U.S. troop levels in Europe, without so much as a courtesy call to Congress. He called it deeply misguided and dangerous, which in political terms is code for "we just found out about this from an angry general and now we're scrambling to look like we're in charge." Of course, no political plan has been announced yet because Trump's governing style is less strategic roadmap and more chaotic tweet followed by mass confusion. But the writing's on the wall. The administration has made it clear that it's bored with Europe and wants to focus on two things: saber-rattling at China and turning the US southern border into some kind of dystopian fortress state. Trump is demanding that NATO allies step up in a way that sounds an awful lot like "we're ditching you, good luck with the whole Russia thing." The hearing, attended by US European Command and Africa Command leaders, confirmed what everyone already suspected. The administration is considering scaling back its presence in Europe and even bailing on its leadership role in NATO's Allied Command. A strong defense strategy is abandoning leadership of nuclear command and control. Who needs that, right? It's not like we're facing an increasingly aggressive Russia or like Ukraine is fighting for its survival while America's commander-in-chief openly fantasizes about letting Putin take whatever he wants. General Christopher Cavoli, a man who probably wakes up every morning wondering how his military career landed him in this mess, tried to remind everyone that keeping US troops in Europe actually matters. He pointed to an increased allied defense spending since Russia's 2022 invasion, which Trump probably still calls a territorial dispute, and warned against pulling intelligence and military support away from Ukraine because, shocker, if you cut off aid and withdraw forces, you're not just reevaluating priorities, you're giving Putin and a green light to keep going. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Lil Marco, the lightweight choker, is currently in Brussels doing his best impression of a functioning diplomat, trying to convince NATO allies that America is still totally committed to the alliance, even as Trump's policies scream the exact opposite. It's a tough sell when your boss is openly hostile to NATO, loves dictators, and has spent years whining that European countries should pay him personally for protection. Even in a Congress filled with GOP bootlickers, this might be a step too far. The hearing showed a rare bipartisan concern over these shifts, which means even some Republicans are getting nervous about the long-term consequences of Trump gutting America's influence in Europe. But let's be honest, concern means nothing if they're too cowardly to actually do anything about it. In a world where politicians lie with impunity, billionaires rewrite history in real time, and social media is basically a misinformation fire hose, New Jersey has decided that at the very least, you shouldn't be able to use AI to create fake videos that destroy someone's life. Governor Phil Murphy just signed a law making it a crime to produce or distribute deceptive deepfakes, slapping offenders with up to 5 years in prison and giving victims the right to sue. And honestly, good, because deepfakes aren't just harmless internet jokes. They're a weapon, whether it's AI-generated revenge pornography, ruining someone's life, fake political videos undermining elections, or bad actors distorting reality for profit. This tech is already being used in ways that can cause real harm. The fact that we didn't have solid laws against it before now is actually the shocking part. The law was partially inspired by Francesca Manni, a high school student whose life was turned upside down by a deepfake video. At the time, her perpetrator got off with a school suspension. A suspension. Imagine having your entire reputation torched by some AI-generated lie and watching the person responsible get a vacation from school. The law makes sure that this kind of nonsense never happens again. Before the free speech purists want to start whining, let's be clear. This isn't about stopping satire or jokes. You can still make a meme, you can still do political commentary, and Saturday Night Live isn't going to jail for Trump impersonations. Yet, this is about making sure people can't use AI to fabricate reality in a way that ruins lives. And given that we already live in an era where a significant chunk of the population believes whatever nonsense they see on the internet, the last thing we need is even more hyper-realistic lies muddying the waters. Deepfake technology is powerful, and like any powerful tool, it needs guardrails. New Jersey did what the federal government should have done ages ago: treat AI-generated deception like the serious threat it is. A group of scientists is now suing the National Institute of Health for canceling science. The lawsuit claims that since Trump's glorious return to the White House, the NIH has been slashing research grants left and right. Not because the science was bad, but because the topics made conservatives clutch their pearls too hard. Apparently, if your research dares to mention words like diversity, gender, or vaccine, it gets thrown into the bureaucratic trash can. That means hundreds of studies on things like HIV prevention, child violence, pregnancy health disparities, and Alzheimer's have been left to die so Trump's NIH can focus on what exactly? Studies on why billionaires deserve more tax breaks? The lawsuit, filed in Massachusetts, argues that gutting these grants isn't just wildly unethical, it's also a massive waste of taxpayer money. When you yank funding mid-study, all that previous investment goes straight down the drain, right along with any progress those projects were making towards, curing actual diseases and saving lives. But sure, let's pretend the biggest crisis in America right now is woke science. The Department of Health and Human Services, the agency overseeing NIH, has given us the classic non-response of "we decline to comment," which is government speak for, yeah, this is definitely happening, but we're not legally required to explain ourselves, so we won't. At the end of the day, this lawsuit is about more than just restoring lost research funding. It's about whether science in America has to tiptoe around the fragile egos of the far right just to get anything done. Because if that's the case, we might as well start handing out government grants for faith healing and essential oils. The very stable genius strikes again, this time in a British courtroom where Trump just got smacked with an $820,000 legal bill for a lawsuit that was so bad the judge didn't even bother debating whether the claims were true. After years of whining about the Steele dossier, Trump finally took his grievances to the UK legal system, only to be told, in legal terms, please shut up and go home. For those who need a refresher, the Steele dossier was a 2016 report compiled by former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele. It is full of very interesting disgusting allegations about Trump's activities in Russia. Trump, of course, insisted the whole thing was fake news, a deep state hit job, and whatever else he yells about at 3 a.m. on Truth Social. So in 2022, he decided to sue Orbis Business Intelligence, the firm behind the dossier claiming it violated UK data protection laws. And then, nothing. Trump waited so long to actually file the lawsuit that the judge tossed it out for being too late and doomed to fail anyway. But since Trump never met a legal bill he didn't try to dodge, he also failed to pay the original fine of 200,090 euros, forcing yet another judge to step in and jack up the price to 600,000 euros plus a spicy 12% daily interest until he coughs it up. Now he's on the hook for a legal tab that's growing more every day. Money that could have gone toward, I don't know, paying his actual legal defense team for the 500 other lawsuits he's currently drowning in. Instead, he's out here proving once again that the one thing he's truly gifted at is turning legal battles into expensive, humiliating public spectacles. So now the big question is, does Trump actually pay up, or does he treat this like his other unpaid bills and wait for some hapless lawyer to take the fall? Either way, British courts just reminded the world of a simple fact: no amount of bluster, delay tactics, or truthless social posts can save you from the legal consequences of being really bad at suing people. In a move that truly screams, we don't care about war crimes, Hungary has decided to quit the International Criminal Court, right as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu touches down in Budapest. The timing, totally a coincidence, we're sure. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who has never met an authoritarian power grab he didn't like, went full attack mode on the ICC, calling its actions against Netanyahu outrageously impudent and cynical, because obviously, expecting anyone to be held accountable for alleged war crimes in Gaza is just so rude. Meanwhile, Netanyahu, currently starring in his own international legal drama, called Hungary's move bold and principled, because nothing says principled like dipping out on the entire international justice system. Now, before Orban can officially slam the door on the ICC, Hungary has to go through some bureaucratic hoops, like notifying the United Nations and passing legislation. So technically, Hungary is still bound by the ICC rules for now, which means Netanyahu's Budapest getaway remains a legal gray zone. But hey, Orban clearly wants to make it very clear that the ICC can't tell Hungary what to do, especially when it comes to inconvenient things like prosecuting war crimes. Unsurprisingly, international human rights groups are not thrilled. They're out here reminding the world that yes, ditching the ICC to protect a political ally accused of war crimes is exactly as bad as it sounds, but let's be real, Orban and Netanyahu aren't losing sleep over the human rights community's opinion. This is about something much simpler. If international law gets in the way of your agenda, just opt out, problem solved. At this rate, why stop at the ICC? Maybe Orban and Netanyahu can form their own international court where the only war crime is being held accountable. In today's episode of How to Tank the Global Economy Without Really Trying, the Dow just threw itself out a window, falling over 2,100 points because President Donald J. Tariff decided to poke the second largest economy in the world with a flaming stick. Yes, after Trump slapped tariffs on Chinese imports like a toddler trying to fix a microwave with a hammer, China fired back with 34% tariffs on everything American. And Wall Street reacted the only way it knows how, by collapsing in a full-blown panic spiral. The S&P 500 and NASDAQ both face-planted nearly 5%. Commodity prices went into freefall, and entire sectors are bleeding like they just got a surprise amputation. DuPont, GE Healthcare, and any company that so much as whispers the word China in a quarterly report are getting absolutely wrecked. But don't worry, Trump says it's just necessary surgery. You know, like cutting off both your legs to cure a headache. According to him, this whole thing is part of some genius 80 chess plan to bring back manufacturing jobs, attract investment, and make America great again by recreating the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve is standing in a corner like a medic in a war zone, whispering that they can't really cut interest rates anymore because inflation's still doing the cha-cha slide. Or in other words, the economy is on fire and the firefighters are out of water. All of this came despite a solid jobs report of 228,000 new jobs in March. But apparently that's not enough to calm investors when the leader of the free world is using international trade as a blunt weapon with zero regard for consequence. Let's be clear, this isn't economic strategy, it's economic cosplay. Trump is playing FDR with the diplomacy of a rusty chainsaw, and the only ones getting richer are the guys shorting the market and stashing their cash in bunkers. So buckle up, comrades, we're watching the free market get freedom bombed by its own flag-waving, golf club-wielding emperor. And in true capitalist irony, the more Trump tries to win this trade war, the more America looks like it's losing a very stupid, very expensive game of chicken. I found out that fiscal responsibility is setting the economy on fire and throwing gas-soaked tax cuts into the blaze. Senate Republicans are now moving full speed ahead with President Trump's latest fever dream, a $4.5 trillion giveaway to the ultra-rich, duct-taped to $2 trillion in cuts to whatever scraps of the social safety net are still intact. This little masterpiece of economic sadism is dubbed Trump's Big Beautiful Bill because economic arson wrapped in a flag didn't test well with focus groups and would make his first-term tax scam look like amateur hour. We're talking permanent tax breaks, new carve-outs for tipped wages and Social Security income, a $175 billion offering to the border wall altar, and a fresh defense budget bump just to keep the military-industrial complex feeling loved. Oh, and don't worry about the price tag. Republicans swear some of these cuts are already in policy. So, who even needs math anymore? The national debt is a mere $36 trillion, practically a rounding error when your strategy is economic nihilism wrapped in patriotic bunting. Democrats are doing their best, screaming and pointing out that this bill effectively loots healthcare and education to subsidize the yacht upgrades and Raytheon's fourth quarter bonuses. But Republicans hold the majority and are powered by the kind of confidence only possessed by people who've never had to live on a fixed income, ride public transit, or drink tap water in a red state. All of this is happening while the markets are going into cardiac arrest over Trump's tariff rampage and Elon's bizarre side quest to streamline the government into a libertarian startup with zero customer service. We now live in a world where the Department of Government Efficiency is a thing, and it's run by the man who thinks work from home is communism and builds exploding cars for fun. Republicans are racing to slam this sucker through by Memorial Day because nothing honors the working class quite like gutting their benefits. This isn't legislation, this is a declaration of class war written in gold leaf and hand-delivered by a man who thinks tariffs are like Pokeballs. You just keep throwing them out until you catch something. And the American people, well, we're not even the trainers. We're the scorched earth that's left behind after the battle. The American dream now comes with a footnote that reads, offer void where brown, foreign, or politically inconvenient. The Trump administration has quietly started tearing up the visas and legal residency of international college students without warning, without explanation, and without any regard for basic constitutional rights or the fact that, these are legal students. In a policy shift that feels like it was drawn on the back of a Waffle House napkin during a Steve Bannon acid flashback, Immigration Customs Enforcement, America's least favorite acronym, along with IRS and CPAC, is now canceling student visas and legal statuses for minor infractions or alleged national security concerns. What qualifies as a threat these days? Pro-Palestinian activism, a traffic ticket, being from the wrong country at the wrong time while studying the wrong major. Rumiza Ozturk, a Turkish doctoral student at Tufts University, was accused of supporting Hamas with about as much evidence as Trump has of winning the 2020 election. She was detained without charges, trial, or proof because apparently the First Amendment has an asterisk when applied to immigrants. Then there's Alireza Durudi, an Iranian doctoral student in Alabama who was arrested despite being explicitly allowed to stay in the country. Why? National security, said the government. Translation, we don't have to tell you anything, and we like it that way. So in case you haven't been paying attention, this isn't immigration enforcement. This is ideological cleansing. The government isn't just targeting visa overstays. They're targeting political dissenters, particularly those critical of the US's unholy alliance with Israel, or God forbid, the ones with thoughts that diverge from the MAGA Bible. This is about chilling dissent, disrupting research, and putting international academics under the same paranoid surveillance typically reserved for activists, journalists, and TikTok teens with leftist opinions. And universities, they're watching their best and brightest get yanked out mid-semester like it's the 1950s and Joseph McCarthy has a badge and a drone. Federal officials don't even bother calling the schools anymore. One day a student is in class, the next they're in ICE custody over a tweet, a protest, or the fact that they read the wrong book in Arabic. The White House maintains its trademark, who, us, innocents, while silently laying the foundation for a fully weaponized immigration policy designed to punish not only the undocumented, but also the deeply documented if they're not white, quiet, and useful. So if you're an international student in 2025 America, I'm sorry. You're a tweet, a suspicion, or a protest away from deportation. This isn't just racist bureaucracy, it's academic sabotage wrapped in a flag and sold as national security. And if you're wondering whether this stops with students or immigrants, the answer is no, it never does. In another episode of Mike Johnson Fails at Empathy, the House Speaker tried to block a proposal that would let new parents in Congress vote by proxy during their 12 weeks of diaper-soaked, sleep-deprived chaos. The bill was bipartisan, shockingly humane, and introduced by Republican Representative Anna Paulina Luna and Democrat Representative Brittany Pedersen, basically saying, hey, if you just brought a human into the world, maybe you shouldn't have to haul your postpartum body across the country to press a button in the chamber. Johnson, who governs like a sentient church bulletin, decided no, the Constitution demands physical presence, because what the framers obviously intended in 1787 was for exhausted new mothers to travel 2 weeks after a C-section just to vote on a farm subsidy bill. Unfortunately for Johnson, reality is a harsh mistress, and so are the moms in Congress. 9 Republicans defected and sided with Democrats to block his attempt to kill the proposal. That's 206 to 222 for those keeping score. Johnson tried to save face by promising to explore alternative accommodations, which is political speak for, we'll maybe get you a lactation bathroom stall and an encouraging Bible verse. Donald Trump, the eternal chaos muppet and newly reinstalled emperor of the GOP, came out in support of the proxy vote. If you're having a baby, I think you should be able to call in and vote, Trump said in a very rare moment of lucidity. That puts Johnson in the awkward position of arguing against babies and the MAGA Pope. It's a lose-lose, and you love to see it. This moment, while small, is telling. Johnson and his Purity Core Christian Cosplay Caucus think family values means banning books and scolding poor people, not actually helping families, especially not the ones who work in government. Meanwhile, the rest of Congress is like, maybe the people who give birth should get to recover without being penalized by 18th century procedure fetishism. So congrats to the new parents in Congress. You might be allowed to vote from the hospital or the nursery. And Mike Johnson, he gets to sit in his office and stew over the radical idea that parenting is hard and sometimes representation means working smarter, not just harder while bleeding. Harvard, the latest battleground in Trump's war against higher education, where the only thing offensive to his administration isn't Nazis, but students wearing face masks at protests. Yet, Trump's government is holding $9 billion in federal funding hostage unless Harvard bends the knee and rewrites its entire campus policy to match his personal authoritarian wish list. The list of demands reads like something out of an Orwellian fever dream. No masks at protests, because clearly the biggest threat to student safety isn't violent agitators or police crackdowns, but some sophomore trying to avoid being doxxed. Stricter speech and protest policies, because the party that screams about free speech constantly being under attack really means only the speech they approve of. Gutting diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, because equal opportunity is shoving marginalized students back into the shadows. And the cherry on top, Trump wants complete control over hiring and admissions, demanding that Harvard eliminate race and identity-based preferences. You know, the same preferences that give white, wealthy, legacy students a free ride while everyone else has to fight for scraps. But yeah, let's pretend this is about fairness. We need to be honest, though. This was never about anti-Semitism. If Trump actually cared about that, he'd start with the Nazis in his own administration. This is about power. This is about using federal money to force universities to purge progressive ideals and enforce conservative orthodoxy. It's a test case. Harvard is one of the first, but not the last. Every school that even slightly challenges right-wing hegemony is next, because to these people, education is the enemy and an informed critical thinking population is a threat. They don't want students learning history. They want them indoctrinated. They don't want debates. They want obedience. They don't want academic freedom. They want ideological control. The scariest part, they might get it, because when billions of dollars are on the line, even institutions as powerful as Harvard have a breaking point. And once enough of them fall in line, the rest will follow. This is about silencing dissent before it even begins. And if we don't fight it, the next generation won't even know what they lost. Let's talk about the dystopian farce happening in Florida, where instead of fixing the housing crisis, tackling poverty, fake addiction treatment centers, or addressing rampant gun violence, the state has decided that the real threat to public safety is a transgender college student using a restroom. Marcy Rankin, a 20-year-old woman from Illinois, went to the Florida state capitol, walked into a women's bathroom, and walked out in handcuffs because she dared to exist in a place that makes Ron DeSantis uncomfortable. She told all 160 lawmakers ahead of time what she was going to do. It wasn't a surprise ambush, it was civil disobedience, a peaceful protest against a vile and extreme law. And how did Florida respond? Like the freedom-loving defenders of liberty they claim to be? No. They had her arrested for trespassing, as if using the bathroom is now a criminal act depending on the genitalia you were assigned at birth. Unfortunately, she's facing 60 days in jail. 60 days for peeing. This is the first known enforcement of Florida's anti-trans bathroom law. They're testing the waters with Marcy, a young woman who committed the egregious crime of using a restroom that matched her gender identity. This is the world the GOP is building, where your body, your identity, and your dignity are all subject to state surveillance and punishment. Limited government is checking your birth certificate before you're allowed to wipe. Here's the part I don't like the most. They want her to suffer. Marcy has real concerns that she'll be put in a men's jail where trans women face horrific abuse. She could be denied hormone treatments and locked up with people who see her as less than human, all because Florida decided that bathrooms are now battlegrounds in their culture war. These laws aren't about safety, they're about control, about humiliation, about forcing trans people back into the closet or into exile. It's the same fascist playbook with a new target: dehumanize, criminalize, and then act shocked when people resist. But Marcy, she's got more courage than the entire Florida legislature combined. She stood up, she walked into that bathroom knowing exactly what would happen, she turned her arrest into a spotlight, and now the whole country sees what this is: bigotry in law enforcement's clothing. This is a test case. If they get away with it here, they'll come for more states, more people, more rights. This is how it starts, with a toilet and the government trying to flush away human dignity. If you were hoping the American healthcare system would finally get the leadership it deserves, congratulations, your prayers have been answered by a man who once told viewers to sprinkle raspberry ketones on their cereal to lose belly fat. That's right, Dr. Oz has been officially confirmed by the Senate to run the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. This isn't a joke, it just feels like one. A bad one, the kind your weird uncle tells after Thanksgiving dinner. In a 53-45 vote, the Senate decided that a man best known for selling miracle beans and hawking detox scams on daytime TV should now oversee healthcare for over 150 million Americans. Medicare, Medicaid, and the Affordable Care Act. Billions of dollars, millions of lives, and the fate of our most vulnerable all now fall under the watchful eye of heavenly contoured gaze of Dr. Oz. Rest assured, though, Dr. Oz has plans. He's going to solve everything with kale and chatbots. He's pushing telehealth, artificial intelligence, and healthier lifestyles, which is political code for don't get sick if you can't afford it. He supports work requirements for Medicaid recipients because in his mind, people need to earn their right to survive. If you're disabled or elderly and can't clock in at a Walmart, I guess that's just nature's way of telling you it's time to go. Let's not forget who's standing behind him with that eerie anti-vax grin: Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who just gutted hundreds of positions from federal health agencies, including entire departments that handled minority health and cost management. Who needs oversight when you got turmeric, I guess? Together, these two are like the what if of public health disasters. What if your weird cousin who believes essential oils cure diabetes took control of the country's largest healthcare programs? Dr. Oz claims he still supports vaccines. He just wants to have a conversation. You know, the kind of conversation where people die from measles. Meanwhile, he's publicly refused to oppose Medicaid cuts, even as Kennedy swings a machete through federal health jobs, and he's tight-lipped on how slashing services for the poor and elderly fits into his wellness revolution. Maybe he's planning to just manifest more funding. This isn't reform. It's a hostile takeover of our healthcare system by televangelists and lab coats. The grift has gone institutional. Medicare and Medicaid are being served up like late-night infomercial products. Buy now and we'll throw in this unqualified millionaire for free. Just pay a shipping and handling fee. Only the cost of your soul. We're witnessing the death of expertise, drowned in a green juice cleanse and wrapped in a lab coat for plausible deniability. The man who told America that astrology could help you lose weight is now declaring who gets cancer treatment. If that doesn't terrify you, you might already be dead. In a rare win for logic, science, and anyone who occasionally likes not dying, a federal judge has temporarily blocked Donald Trump's plan to get $11 billion in public health funding, just before it could finish rolling through America's healthcare system like a rusty lawnmower over a mass grave. Judge Mary McElroy, delivering what may be the only good judicial news this week, issued a temporary restraining order after 23 states and DC sued the administration for trying to rip the spine out of their healthcare budgets. These cuts, aimed at COVID-19 funding and other unnecessary public health initiatives were, according to Trump's Department of Health and Human Services, no longer needed because the pandemic is over. You know, that same pandemic that continues to kill people, exacerbate chronic illnesses, and leave millions with long-term health complications. But hey, what's science when you got vibes? The lawsuit argues correctly that this money isn't just pandemic emergency cash. It's the lifeblood of state-level healthcare systems. We're talking programs for mental health, substance abuse, immunization drives, elder care, and actual infrastructure needed to survive whatever catastrophe hits next. So naturally, the Trump administration thought, why not cut it? It's not theoretical either. States are already bleeding jobs and services. Minnesota laid off 200 health workers, California is staring down $1 billion black hole, and North Carolina stands to lose $230 million, which is a hell of a lot of ventilators and addiction clinics. And Pennsylvania's governor, he's screaming until his voice is gone that you can't take away $500 million for vaccines and elder care. The Trump team claims this is about streamlining post-pandemic spending, but what it actually looks like is deliberate sabotage of public health because small government is letting more people die of preventable deaths, I guess. It's the libertarian dream. Get sick, go broke, and die fast, preferably off the books, so your demise doesn't mess with the quarterly GDP numbers. This isn't just a budget cut, it's a mass euthanasia of infrastructure carried out with spreadsheets and smirks. The plan doesn't just weaken pandemic readiness, it hobbles mental health services, addiction treatment, elder care, and the capacity of overwhelmed states to function in a post-COVID world already teetering on collapse. Judge McElroy's ruling puts the brakes on for now, but this is a stay of execution, not a pardon. The administration can still appeal, and the GOP's long war on healthcare will continue, now under the careful leadership of Dr. Oz and RFK Jr., who would love nothing more than to swap out your hospital visit for a TikTok of celery juice recipes. This is what happens when ideology outpaces empathy and death becomes a line item in a budget. Public health is not a luxury, it's a basic obligation of governance, and this administration would rather dismantle that obligation brick by brick just to prove that government doesn't work by making sure it doesn't. So if you're one of the millions who rely on these programs, keep your fingers crossed and your insurance card handy. The virus may be evolving, but the cruelty, that's the same strain we've been dealing with since 2016. In a scene straight out of Black Mirror, but somehow dumber, a man named Jerome DeWald decided to spice up his legal strategy by having an AI avatar argue his case before the New York State Supreme Court's Appellate Division. It went as well as you'd expect. Within seconds, the judges pulled the plug like they were killing off a bad deepfake of Law & Order ChatGPT unit. DeWald, who is representing himself in an employment dispute, because of course he is, claims he used the AI avatar to enhance communication. That's a noble spin on I wanted my argument to look like it was delivered by a dead-eyed tech demon with perfect dictation and no soul. He didn't tell the judges in advance, which is generally frowned upon when the fate of a legal proceeding hangs in the balance. The court was not amused. Justice Sally Manzanet Daniels expressed disappointment, which is legalese for what the actual hell are you doing? To DeWald's credit, he apologized and insisted he wasn't trying to deceive anyone. He just thought a synthetic talking head would be more compelling than, I guess, a living, breathing human being with a stake in the outcome. This, folks, is what happens when you read too many startup blogs and not enough case law. I mean, I guess to be fair, this isn't totally unprecedented. Some courts like Arizona's Supreme Court are experimenting with AI avatars for public communications, but that's like explainer videos on how to file a motion, not arguing a case that could set a precedent for real humans. You know, baby steps. Meanwhile, DeWald tried to leap straight into RoboCounselAttorney.exe. Legal experts are already bracing for more of this nonsense, as self-represented litigants without lawyers turn to AI tools to level the playing field. And yeah, there's something kind of tragic there. Real people are so alienated by the legal system that they're building digital clones to speak for them. We also have to draw a line, though, because once we start allowing synthetic attorneys into courtrooms, we officially turn the justice system into a bad cutscene from a dystopian courtroom simulator. These tools aren't sentient, they can't be held accountable, and if one ever starts citing legal precedent from Star Wars or the Bible, it'll be too late. This whole episode is a neon warning sign. We're sleepwalking into a future where people think AI should do everything for them, including speaking in court, making laws, maybe even sentencing each other. And unless the legal system wakes up fast, we're gonna end up with a judiciary full of avatars, algorithms, and no actual accountability. So let's be thankful for Justice Manzanet Daniels and the New York bench for pulling the plug, because if the justice system is going to fall apart, it shouldn't be because some guy couldn't be bothered to read his own damn argument out loud. Israel launched another round of airstrikes in Gaza on Friday, killing at least 17 people, including entire families, and injuring at least 16 more. If this were the first time, it would be a tragedy, but it's not the first time. It's not even the first time this week. The day before, over 100 Palestinians were killed in another round of bombardment. This is not new. This is not unexpected. It is deliberate, calculated genocide, the slow, methodical destruction of an entire people under the pretense of security. And if the word genocide makes you uncomfortable, good. Because what else do you call it when a military kills over 50,000 people, most of them women and children, in less than a year? What else do you call it when a government systematically starves an entire population by blocking food, water, and medicine? What else do you call it when entire families are wiped out, their homes reduced to dust, their names lost to history, all while the world looks away? What do you call it? Israel isn't defending itself. It's erasing Gaza from the map. It's turning every street into a graveyard, every hospital into a morgue, every school into rubble. The Netzarim corridor, a cold, bureaucratic term for what is essentially a ghetto, is just another way to divide and conquer, another piece of the puzzle of forced displacement and ethnic cleansing. They bomb civilians, then blame them for dying in the wrong place at the wrong time. There is no wrong place. Gaza is the wrong place. Gaza is a death trap, and Israel has the key. The sheer scale of the horror is beyond comprehension. 280,000 people have been forced from their homes again in just the last few weeks. That's not counting the millions already displaced. That's not counting the ones who never got to flee because an Israeli missile found them first. That's not counting the ones trapped under rubble, suffocating before rescuers can reach them. And the bombs are still falling. And for what? What is this really about? Their official excuse is still Hamas. The excuse is always Hamas. But if things were about Hamas, why is Israel bombing refugee camps, hospitals, and UN shelters? Why are they targeting journalists? Why are they cutting off humanitarian aid? Why are they massacring children? Hamas is the excuse. The goal is total destruction. And yet, world leaders pretend they don't see it. They talk about Israel's right to defend itself while ignoring the mountains of Palestinian corpses. They beg for restraint as entire neighborhoods are turned to dust. They call for peace talks as Israel blocks humanitarian aid and turns starvation into a weapon of war. They make vague statements about concern while actively funding and supplying the genocide they claim to oppose. The United States is complicit. The European Union is complicit. Every government that continues to arm Israel, every politician who refuses to call this what it is, every journalist who waters down the truth with words like conflict or tragedy, they are all complicit. This is not war. This is genocide. Stop lying to yourself. If there is any justice left in this world, the people responsible will pay for what they have done to the people, the men, the women, and children of Gaza. In Washington, the Senate just approved what we're calling the Live, Laugh, Loot budget, $7 trillion in Trump-branded tax cuts paired with a MAGA vision of a government that's somehow both omnipresent at the border and completely absent anywhere else. The plan paves the way for lawmakers in the White House to start slashing social services, gives a massive amount of handouts to our poor, starving billionaire class, ramps up spending for border security, and throws gasoline on the already raging dumpster fire that is our national debt, now ballooning past $36 trillion. That's trillion with a T, as in too bad if you ever wanted to retire. The budget passed along party lines, unless you count the few Republicans who briefly remembered their souls still technically exist. Senator Susan Collins and Josh Hawley, yeah, that guy, the January 6th guy, tried to soften the blow by backing amendments to protect Social Security and Medicaid. Schumer, sensing an opportunity for some good old-fashioned political theater, tossed in an amendment to limit Trump's beloved tariffs. It failed, obviously, but not before exposing the deep ideological rot spreading through the GOP like a flesh-eating bacteria in a hospital without funding. Rand Paul, that silly eternal libertarian gremlin, voted no, not because the budget destroyed the safety net, but because it didn't go far enough. His logic? Why stop at $5 trillion in new debt when you can burn it all down and sell the ashes to Elon Musk? Democrats scrambled to protect what little remains of the social contract. Medicaid, food stamps, Head Start, childcare, elder care, programs that actually help people. The amendments failed because apparently feeding children is now considered a radical leftist agenda, and to top it off, Trump's new tariffs are already gutting the markets like a fish. But sure, let's call this a victory. A big, beautiful, budgetary middle finger to anyone not profiting from human misery. So remember, when you can't afford insulin, but your cousin gets drafted to defend a tariff-induced banana war in Guam, just know it's all part of the plan. 29-year-old Kilmar Abrego Garcia had lived in Maryland for over a decade, legally, with his wife and children. He fled El Salvador in 2011 to escape gang violence, and in 2019, a court ruled that he could not be deported. That didn't stop Trump, and that didn't stop ICE, who yanked him off the street last month and deported him anyway, like the Constitution comes with an asterisk and a footnote that says, unless we feel spicy. Now, Garcia is sitting in El Salvador's infamous terrorism confinement center, basically a prison designed by people who read 1984 and thought, but what if it was worse? The judge who issued the original ruling was understandably furious and ordered the government to go get him back by April 7th, but the Trump DOJ just said, nah, their excuse, the executive branch doesn't have to follow that court order because it would require working with another country, which apparently is now the equivalent to summoning Cthulhu. And here's where it somehow goes off the rails even more. The government's lawyers actually argued that they have no more power to return Garcia than they would to, quote, effectuate the end of the war in Ukraine or return of the hostages from Gaza. Yeah, they seriously compared fixing their own screw-up of illegally deporting a man whose life is now in danger to ending a global armed conflict and rescuing hostages from a military siege. And these people, they run our country. They also tossed in an evidence-free claim that Garcia has ties to MS-13 because no Trump-era scandal is complete without a pinch of racist fear-mongering. So here we are. A man was illegally deported. A judge said fix it, and the government responded, we can't. We're not wizards, even though it was their own goddamn wand that broke everything. In something that can only be described as authoritarian cosplay with a side of book burning, the U.S. Naval Academy has yanked nearly 400 books from its Nimitz library. The purge is part of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's mission to scrub the military clean of anything related to diversity, equity, or inclusion, otherwise known as the radical idea that other people exist. Gone are books about the Holocaust. Gone are accounts of African Americans who served in World War II. Gone is I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, because Maya Angelou apparently poses a threat to national security, or at least to the brittle egos of men terrified of anything they didn't personally write in crayon. This wasn't just some bored right-wing librarian getting carried away. This was part of an actual government-ordered keyword search. They combed through the shelves with phrases like gender identity, civil rights, and racism, then declared anything that acknowledged these things to be too woke for midshipmen to handle. So the message is clear: train to lead, learn to kill, but for God's sakes, do not read about how America treated black soldiers in the 1940s. Don't read about feminism. Don't read about genocide. That's too divisive. Just stick to the classics like war, war, and more war, preferably written by men with crew cuts and rage issues. And they deny that it had anything to do with Hegseth visiting the campus recently. Just pure coincidence. This isn't about education. It's about control. It's about rewriting history into something simpler, whiter, straighter, and more obedient. It's not just censorship. It's ideological cleansing with a bureaucratic smile. And if you're wondering where that ends, it ends with history repeating itself, and no one left who's allowed to read about the last time. A Russian missile obliterated a residential neighborhood in Kryvyi Rih, President Zelensky's hometown, killing 18 people, including 9 children. Another 61 were injured, and the blast ripped apart 20 apartment buildings, dozens of cars, and the last illusion that there's any part of Ukraine untouched by Russian cruelty. The missile landed near a playground, a place where children learn to climb, fall, and laugh, and now it's a crater. Zelensky called it what it was: terrorism, and begged for better air defenses. Meanwhile, the U.S. Embassy offered their signature brand of lukewarm thoughts and prayers without even bothering to name the attacker. Can't offend Moscow too directly, right? Wouldn't want to disturb the delicate feelings of a genocidal regime. And because no tragedy is too great for Russian propaganda to twist into a lie, Moscow claims the strike was aimed at a meeting of Ukrainian commanders and Western personnel. Right, near a playground at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. Maybe the commanders were all disguised as 5-year-olds playing tag. Just hours later, another Russian drone strike killed a woman and wounded 7 more. It's like clockwork now. Wake up, dig out the bodies, bury them, repeat. But it's not a war, not in the clean cinematic sense we'd like to imagine. It's an ongoing act of genocide fueled by one man's obsession with empire and the world's cowardice to stop him. It's children in body bags while Western diplomats play footsie with their neutrality. Ukraine isn't asking for miracles, just the tools to stop their skies from raining death. So let's get it straight. If you see someone still calling for peace without naming Russia, they're not anti-war, they're just pro-collateral damage. The only both sides here are alive children and dead ones. In a rare and much-needed display of spine, New York state officials have informed the Trump administration that they will not, in fact, be gutting diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in their public schools, no matter how hard the federal government threatens to pull funding. Because someone in Albany remembered that authoritarian decrees from a guy who thinks bleach cures viruses aren't legally binding, the Trump edict gave every K-12 school in the country 10 days to swear a loyalty oath promising they'd erase any trace of DEI from their curriculum, hiring, staff training, and presumably bathroom graffiti. If schools didn't comply, they'd lose federal money. Wow, I guess caring about kids is when you withhold funding from poor districts unless they agree to stop acknowledging that racism exists. New York's education department, led by Daniel Morton Bentley, fired back with a polite version of eat shit. In their letter, they pointed out that the feds don't actually have the authority to do this without going through proper channels like laws, due process, and basic reality. More importantly, New York said DEI isn't some illegal radical cult, it's actually aligned with federal and state law. You know, the ones that say schools aren't supposed to discriminate or teach kids that white supremacy was just a misunderstood marketing campaign. Of course, this is all part of Trump's broader strategy to turn public schools into little ideological prisons where every book is about Andrew Jackson and the only color in the classroom is beige. He promised to give control of education back to the states, unless, of course, the states don't obey his every command like a dog begging for scraps, because this isn't about education, it's about purging any concept that threatens the MAGA worldview. Equity, gone. Empathy, dead. Black History Month, not unless it ends with "but they were happier under Reagan." New York's resistance matters. It's one of the first real shots fired in the classroom culture war, and other states need to pay attention, because once you let an administration erase inclusion, they won't stop there. In an act that only makes sense if your brain has been replaced by a wood chipper, the Trump administration just slashed protections across more than half of America's national forests, an area the size of Germany, so they can log the ever-loving hell out of them. Now, why would they do that? To prevent wildfires, allegedly. Yeah, apparently the solution to climate-fueled infernos is to remove the trees entirely. Can't burn if there's nothing left to catch fire, right? That's not policy, that's a supervillain monologue. Agriculture's Secretary Brooke Rollins, whose name kind of sounds like a character from Yellowstone who poisons horses, issued an emergency directive giving the U.S. Forest Service free rein to gut environmental reviews and silence public input. The new rules fast-track logging operations and let the timber industry treat national forests like their own personal Home Depot. They even killed off the administrative objection process. That's the part where communities and conservation groups could say, hey, maybe don't clear-cut 1 million acres next to a town full of retirees with asthma. Now they can yell into a void while bulldozers start their engines. This absolutely is not about wildfire prevention. If it were, we'd be funding controlled burns, managing underbrush, or, I don't know, doing literally anything else backed by science. Instead, it's a $7 billion love letter to the timber lobby with a PS that says screw the birds. Environmental groups are already sounding the alarm, calling this what it is: a forest liquidation sale disguised as safety. Meanwhile, logging executives are just foaming at the mouth over the possibility of doubling timber harvests, boosting sawmill jobs, and cashing in on the sudden freedom to chainsaw through public land like it's a piñata stuffed with profit. Look, nobody's saying wildlife prevention isn't serious, but turning half the country's forest into matchsticks isn't a safety measure, it's a climate death spiral in a lumberjack costume. Let's not pretend this ends with forests either. This is what authoritarian extractivism looks like. Strip the land, silence the people, profit, repeat. Measles is back, and not in a fun retro way. The US has racked up 607 measles cases in just 3 months into 2025, more than double what we had in all of 2024. At this rate, smallpox is going to rise from the grave like a DLC boss fight. Leading the viral parade is Texas, because of course it is, with 481 cases packed into one mostly unvaccinated Mennonite community in Gaines County. New Mexico's got 54, Kansas has 24, and Oklahoma and Ohio are doing their best to keep pace, as if this were a TikTok challenge titled "How Fast Can We Unlearn Science?" Unfortunately, 2 people are already dead, one of them a child in Texas and another an adult in New Mexico. Those numbers are likely to climb because measles is a brutal little bastard, one of the most contagious viruses known to humanity, and one that we'd virtually wiped off the map before a vocal minority decided that injecting their kids with anything other than vibes and garlic cloves was tyranny. This isn't a medical mystery. This isn't like COVID-19, where people were scrambling to understand a novel virus. This is measles, something we solved decades ago with a safe, simple, highly effective vaccine. It's not even controversial among doctors unless your medical license is printed on a Bible page. And yet, here we are, thanks in large part to America's new religion of misinformation, led by high priests like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who believes your immune system is a divine force field that can only be compromised by socialism. The CDC is begging parents to vaccinate their children, but conspiracy-fueled communities are treating public health advice like it's a satanic ritual. They hear MMR and think it's a mind control chip implanted by the deep state and the ghost of Anthony Fauci. And look, yeah, some of this is due to isolated, close-knit religious communities, but don't let the rest of the country off the hook. Vaccine skepticism is mainstream now. There are people who think antibiotics make you sicker, but raw milk cures leukemia. We had a vaccine. We had herd immunity, and we pissed it away because someone's cousin shared a meme from a Facebook group called Moms Against Science. You wanted freedom from mandates? Congratulations, you're free to die from a virus that should only exist in textbooks and Oregon Trail simulators. This weekend, over 1,200 hands-off protests erupted across all 50 states as Americans rallied against the unholy alliance of Donald Trump and Elon Musk, a combo nobody asked for, but now we're stuck with, like a cursed Wish.com order. These protests were organized by more than 150 groups, civil rights organizations, labor unions, LGBTQ+ advocates, veterans, and probably some librarians with bloodlust, and they all came together for one simple reason: to tell Trump and Musk to keep their goddamn hands off our rights, our jobs, and our dignity. Rallies hit everywhere from DC to Boston to Columbus, Ohio, and even outside Trump's sacred golf mecca in Florida, where protesters bravely chanted within earshot of a man who once tried to nuke a hurricane. So why are people pissed? Oh, just a casual list of horrors like slashing federal jobs, shutting down social security offices, erasing entire agencies like their browser tabs, rolling back transgender protections, deporting immigrants like it's a competitive sport, and cutting healthcare funding in the middle of a measles outbreak. The administration's defense statement, and oh my gosh, I wish I was joking, was basically, we're protecting Medicare and Social Security by making sure illegal immigrants don't steal it with their crazy mind powers or whatever. I may be paraphrasing a bit, but not as much as you think, because if there's one thing that collapses government entitlement programs, it's definitely not tax cuts for billionaires. It's that undocumented grandmother getting insulin. At one rally, labor union Paul Osadebe summed it up. Trump and Musk are devaluing public workers and torching communities, which is generous, really. I'd say they're gutting the country like a fish and selling the bones to SpaceX for rocket fuel. Now, let's talk about Musk for a second, because he's in charge of the Department of Government Efficiency, a title that sounds like something out of a satirical dystopia, but is tragically, unfortunately, real. His plan for efficiency is to replace public services with memes, cryptocurrency, and whatever's left of Twitter after he used it as a toilet. And Trump, he's still playing all the hits, fear-mongering, scapegoating, and sprinting away from facts like he owes them money. And yet, despite the massive turnout, these protests haven't hit the scale of the 2017 Women's March or the 2020 BLM uprisings. Maybe people are exhausted, maybe they're scared, or maybe, just maybe, they're wondering what the hell it's going to take to stop a guy who's been impeached twice, indicted, and now moonlights as a retirement home exterminator. But one thing is clear, people are done being polite about it. The gloves are off, the signs are sharp, and the message is simple: hands off. Because when the government starts to look like a billionaire frat house and your rights are on the chopping block every fiscal quarter, protests become a survival strategy. Hold on to your survival kits, folks. The Trump administration has just axed the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, the last shred of hope some communities had for surviving the natural disasters we all know are coming. Thanks, climate change. And if you thought that things couldn't get worse, they totally can. The BRIC program, which was meant to help communities prepare for things like wildfires and floods, you know, those terrifying things that happen almost weekly now, was designed to save lives and infrastructure. It had already pumped $1 billion into the initiative, and over 450 communities were busy elevating roads and installing drought-resistant systems like their futures depended on it, which, well, they do. But now, poof, all gone. All the BRIC applications submitted between 2020 and 2023 canceled. Any unused grant funds? Well, the administration just took them back, like a rich kid snatching away a toy right before you realize it's the only thing that'll save you from drowning in flood water. Why the change of heart, you ask? It's to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse, because clearly, keeping people alive in the face of rising water and infernos is just a little too much of a waste for these guys. And let's not forget, these are the same people who believe global warming is just an annoying inconvenience. And FEMA's future? Who knows? Trump's got plans to dismantle the agency and hand out money to the states directly, which is basically like giving the keys to the chaos machine and saying, hey, good luck with that. Oh, but don't worry. It's all part of the administration's larger goal of targeting anything related to climate change, disaster preparedness, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those just happen to be the things that ensure the world doesn't, collapse around you. Communities who thought the BRIC grants would give them a fighting chance against natural disasters will now have to cross their fingers and pray the next time wildfires rage or floods drown their neighborhoods. Because caring about the future is when you take away the lifeline for surviving the end of the world. As the central United States slips beneath rising floodwaters, nature is serving up another brutal reminder that we live on a climate change time bomb with a defunded weather service standing in as our only smoke detector. Flash floods are sweeping across Kentucky, Missouri, Arkansas, and Texas, submerging homes, turning roads into rivers, and killing at least 9 people, among them a child who was on his way to school and an elderly person in Kentucky who never had a chance. This isn't just weather, it's a warning call, and nobody's answering the damn phone. The National Weather Service, the agency that's supposed to scream "get out now" when disaster strikes, preferably before disaster strikes, is operating on life support now. Nearly half of its 122 forecast offices are short-staffed, with vacancy rates over 20%. In hard-hit areas like Arkansas and parts of the Midwest, those numbers creep past 35%. It's not just a staffing issue, it's a systemic collapse of our frontline defense against extreme weather, and we did it to ourselves. The culprit? A toxic cocktail of climate denial and efficiency worship. The gutting began under Trump 2.0 and was lovingly turbocharged by Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, a dystopian PR name for we're going to hollow out every institution until they're too weak to stop us from selling survival back to you. The result? Fewer weather balloon launches, delayed storm damage reports, gaps in emergency alert systems, and meteorologists working punishing shifts trying to do the impossible with a skeleton crew and obsolete tech. All of this is happening as climate change cranks the chaos to 11. These aren't isolated events. The rain is heavier, the storms are stronger, and the disasters are stacking like a tipping Jenga tower. The atmosphere is warmer, wetter, and meaner. Flash floods that used to be once in a generation are now twice this spring and again tomorrow. Tornado seasons are more erratic. The jet stream is out here doing interpretive dance. Climate scientists have been screaming about this for decades, and now it's playing out in real time, while the very people meant to keep us alive are being asked to do more with less or do nothing at all. Every cut to the weather service is a gamble that the next storm won't hit your town. Every vacant forecasting office is an invitation to chaos, and yet here we are, watching the country flood while billionaires hoard their savings, and elected officials hold up a soggy finger to the wind and call it leadership. People died because they didn't know what was coming. Next time it'll be more. Climate change isn't slowing down, and if we keep slashing our ability to see it coming, we're not just waterlogged, we're dead. That's all for your weekly Brainrot news recap. We'll see you next week where surely nothing will get better, but we'll be here to narrate the decline. Like, comment, subscribe, or don't. The algorithm's already an Ouroboros of content devouring itself and selling the bones as premium engagement.